The window latch would not move, and Elena Voss could hear boots on the stairs behind her. She pressed her palm flat against the old wood frame and pushed until her fingers ached, and finally the latch gave way with a crack that sounded far too loud in the quiet night. Downstairs, a door slammed. Someone called her name. She did not answer. She had already decided, hours ago, that this was the last night she would spend inside the Thornwood Pack Hall, and nothing short of the building falling down around her was going to change her mind. 3 weeks earlier, she would never have believed she would be standing on a windowsill with a packed bag over her shoulder, ready to run into the dark. 3 weeks earlier, her life had been small and quiet and entirely her own, and that was exactly how she liked it. Elena had trained as a healer since she was 16 years old. She had spent long nights in the pack infirmary, learning how to set bones, how to read the signs of a fever before it turned dangerous, how to stitch a wound with hands that did not shake, even when the patient in front of her was screaming. She was good at her work, and she took pride in it, because it was the one part of pack life that felt like it truly belonged to her. She was not the daughter of an important family. She was not beautiful in the way the pack gossiped about at gatherings. She was simply Elena, the healer, and for years that had been enough. Then came the night of the coronation, and everything she thought she knew about her own life fell apart in the space of a single heartbeat. The Thornwood Pack Hall had been full that night, packed shoulder to shoulder with wolves from every corner of the territory. All of them gathered to watch Cade Ashford take his place as alpha. Elena had come only because attendance was expected of every pack member, healers included. She had stood near the back of the hall, half hidden behind a stone pillar, planning to slip out the moment the ceremony ended. She remembered the torches burning along the walls, the low hum of voices, the smell of wood smoke and crushed pine that always filled the hall on important nights. She remembered Cade standing at the front, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair pushed back from his face, his expression carved from stone. He did not smile as the elders spoke the old words over him. He did not smile as the crowd cheered his name. He simply stood there, straight-backed and unreadable, a man who looked as though he had already decided that leading a pack would cost him something he was not willing to give. Elena had no reason to think any of this concerned her. She was watching the ceremony the way everyone else was watching it, with polite interest and nothing more. And then the elder, speaking the final blessing, said the words that called the mating bond forward. The old words meant only as tradition, a formality repeated at every coronation whether or not a true mate happened to be present. The pull hit her like a wave crashing over a seawall. One moment she was standing quietly behind the pillar, and the next her whole body was humming, with a feeling she had never experienced before, a pull so strong it nearly knocked her off her feet. Her breath caught. Her skin prickled with heat. Every instinct she had went suddenly, completely still. All of it pointed like a compass needle toward the man standing at the front of the hall. She was not the only one who felt it. Cade's head snapped up, his nostrils flared, his eyes swept across the crowd with an intensity that silenced every conversation in the room, and then, impossibly, his gaze landed directly on her. For one long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The Dare Pack Hall seemed to hold its breath along with her. Then Cade's jaw tightened, and something dark passed behind his eyes. Something that was not joy, and was not relief, and was certainly not the wonder that mated pairs were supposed to feel when the bond first appeared. Elena had heard stories her whole life about the mating bond, about how it was supposed to feel like coming home, like finding the missing half of yourself standing in a crowded room. She had never imagined it might feel like being caught doing something wrong. The elders around Cade began to murmur excitedly, already reaching for the ceremonial words that would formally announce a mate to the pack. Cade held up one hand, cutting them off before a single syllable could leave their lips. The silence that followed was worse than any words could have been. He looked at Elena one more time, and this time there was no confusion in his expression, only a hard, closed-off anger that made her stomach drop. Then he turned and walked out of the hall without a single word, his boots striking the stone floor in sharp, deliberate steps, leaving 300 wolves staring after him, and one healer standing frozen behind a pillar, wondering if she had imagined the whole thing. She had not imagined it. The whispers started before the doors had even finished swinging shut behind him. Word moved through the Thornwood pack faster than fire through dry grass. By the time Elena managed to push her way out of the hall, red-faced and shaking, everyone she passed already seemed to know. She caught fragments of conversation as she walked, sharp-edged and cruel in the way gossip always was when it was not meant for the ears of the person it concerned. Someone said the new Alpha looked as though he had swallowed poison. Someone else said the healer girl must have done something to force the bond, though nobody could explain how such a thing was even possible. A group of young wolves near the fountain laughed at something one of them whispered, and Elena did not need to hear the words to know they were laughing at her. She made it back to the small healer's cottage at the edge of the pack grounds before the tears finally came, and even then, she was furious at herself for crying, because crying meant this mattered to her, and she did not want it to matter. She did not know this man. She had exchanged perhaps 10 words with Cade Ashford in her entire life, most of them formal greetings at pack gatherings where he had barely glanced in her direction. And now, through no choice of her own, her body and her instincts had decided he was hers, and his reaction had made it painfully clear that he did not feel the same way, or if he did feel it, he wanted nothing to do with it. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed that night with her knees pulled up to her chest, and she made herself a promise. Whatever happened next, she would not let this bond turn her into someone pathetic. She would not chase a man who had looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. She had built a life out of her own 2 hands, stitch by stitch and bone by bone, and she was not going to let one broken ceremony take that away from her. The summons came the next morning, delivered by a stone-faced pack messenger who would not meet her eyes. The new Alpha wished to see her in his study, immediately. Elena walked to the main pack hall, with her spine straight and her chin lifted, refusing to let anyone see how badly her hands were shaking. The hallways were quieter than usual, and she was fairly certain that was because half the pack had found some excuse to linger nearby, hoping to catch whatever happened next. She knocked on the heavy study door and was told to enter, and she stepped inside to find Cade standing at the window with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, his shoulders set in a rigid line. He did not turn around right away. Elena waited, refusing to be the one who spoke first. Finally he turned, and up close, in the pale morning light, she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, the shadows beneath his eyes that suggested he had not slept at all. For a brief moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He did not offer her a chair. He did not offer any kind of greeting at all. He simply said, in a voice as flat and cold as stone, that he had never wanted a mate, that he did not intend to want one now, and that the bond between them changed nothing about his plans for his own life. Elena felt something in her chest crack, quiet and sharp, like a hairline fracture in glass. She kept her face still. She had spent years learning to control her expression in the infirmary, to keep her patients calm, even when their injuries frightened her, and she used every bit of that training now. She asked him, evenly, what exactly he expected of her, since apparently she had no say in any of this either. His jaw flexed. He said the pack elders would expect her to move into the hall and take on the appearance of a Luna, at least for now, because an Alpha who rejected his mate within days of his coronation would look weak in front of the allied packs gathering for the Autumn Council. He said it would only be for a short while. He said once enough time had passed, once the political situation had settled, he intended to formally reject the bond, and she would be free to return to her cottage and her healing work, as though none of this had ever happened. As though none of this had ever happened, as though the entire pack had not already heard every detail by breakfast, as though she could simply fold this humiliation up and tuck it away like laundry. Elena wanted to refuse. Every instinct in her body told her to walk out of that study and never look back, to let the elders and the allied packs think whatever they wanted, because none of it was truly her problem. But she was not foolish enough to believe that refusing an Alpha's request, even a new and untested Alpha, would end well for her. She thought of her position in the pack, her work in the infirmary, the patients who depended on her. She thought of her own mother, long gone now, who used to say that surviving sometimes meant choosing your battles instead of fighting every single one. So she said yes. She agreed to move into the pack hall. She agreed to play the part he needed her to play, for now, because she had no better option in front of her. But as she turned to leave his study, something small and stubborn kindled inside her, something that had nothing to do with the mating bond and everything to do with pride. She was not going to spend this arrangement waiting quietly to be discarded. If Cade Ashford wanted to treat her like a political inconvenience, she would let him see exactly how little that treatment cost her. She would not beg for his affection. She would not shrink herself down to make this easier for him. Whatever came next, she intended to walk through it with her head held high, and if he ever did decide to reject her, he was going to have to do it while looking her directly in the eye. The room they gave her in the pack hall was larger and finer than her cottage had ever been, with a wide window overlooking the training yard and furniture carved from dark polished wood. It should have felt like an improvement. Instead, it felt like a cage, dressed up to look like a gift. Elena spent her first evening there sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of a household that was not hers, wondering how many months it would take before the bond either grew into something real or was cut away entirely. She thought about the look on Cade's face the moment the bond had snapped into place, the flash of something dark before the anger took over. She wondered, briefly, what exactly he was so afraid of. She did not yet know that his fear had a long history behind it, older than her, older than the coronation, rooted in a wound from his own childhood that had never properly healed. She did not know that his coldness was not really about her at all. All she knew, that first night in the pack hall, was that she was alone in a strange room, bound by instinct to a man who had made it clear he did not want her, and that somehow she was going to have to find a way to survive, whatever came next, with her dignity still intact. Outside her window, the training yard sat empty under the moon, quiet and still. Elena watched it for a long time before she finally closed her eyes, and even in sleep, some small part of her stayed alert, already sensing that this arrangement was not going to stay simple for very long. The next morning came with a knock at her door, before the sun had fully risen. Elena opened it to find a young woman named Marissa standing in the hallway, a tray of tea balanced in her hands, and an expression that mixed curiosity with sympathy in equal measure. Marissa worked in the pack kitchens, and had known Elena for years, ever since Elena had stitched up a nasty burn on her arm after a cooking accident. She was one of the few people in Thornwood who had never treated Elena differently for keeping to herself. Marissa set the tray down on the small table by the window, and did not bother pretending she had come only to deliver breakfast. She asked Elena, gently, how she was holding up, and Elena found herself grateful for the honesty in the question, since everyone else she had passed in the hallway that morning had either stared at her openly or looked away too quickly, as though her presence might be contagious. Elena admitted she did not entirely know how she was holding up. She said it felt like she had woken up inside someone else's life, a life with rules she had never agreed to, and a role she had never auditioned for. Marissa nodded slowly, and said that from what she had heard among the kitchen staff, the new Alpha had barely spoken a word to anyone since the ceremony, and had spent most of the night pacing the length of his study rather than sleeping. Elena was not sure what to do with that information. Part of her wanted to feel some small satisfaction that he was suffering too. A larger part of her simply felt tired. She drank her tea in silence for a while, watching steam curl up from the cup, and then asked Marissa the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest since the study meeting the day before. She asked whether Marissa knew anything about why the new Alpha seemed so set against having a mate at all, since most wolves in the pack spoke of the bond as the greatest blessing life could offer, not something to be feared. Marissa hesitated, glancing toward the door as though worried someone might overhear, and then said quietly that she did not know the full story, only pieces gathered from older staff who had served the pack for decades. She said there had been trouble in the Ashford family, long before Cade was born Alpha's son instead of Alpha himself, trouble that nobody in the household liked to discuss openly. She said the previous Alpha, Cade's father, had been a hard man, and that Cade's mother had not stayed in Thornwood past Cade's 10th birthday. Beyond that, Marissa said, the details blurred into rumor, and rumor was not something she felt right passing along as fact. Elena turned the information over in her mind for the rest of the morning as she unpacked her few belongings into the unfamiliar wardrobe. A mother who had left. A father who was, by Marissa's careful description, a hard man. It was not much to go on, but it was enough to plant a small seed of understanding, where before, there had only been confusion and hurt. It did not excuse the coldness Cade had shown her. It did not make the humiliation of the coronation any easier to carry. But it gave her something to hold on to besides simple anger, and in her line of work, she had learned that understanding the source of a wound was often the first step toward treating it, even when the wound in question belonged to someone else's heart rather than their body. By midday, word had spread through the entire pack hall that the healer had moved into the Alpha's residence, and Elena found herself the subject of stares everywhere she went. She kept her chin lifted and her pace steady, refusing to let anyone see how much the attention unsettled her. She had never been the sort of person people watched. She had spent her whole life comfortably invisible, tending to wounds in the quiet of the infirmary, while the rest of the pack concerned itself with politics and status, and who might rise or fall in the coming season. Now, overnight, she had become the center of every conversation, and she hated it more than she had expected to. She sought refuge in the infirmary that afternoon, grateful for the familiar smell of dried herbs and clean linen, grateful for the simple, honest work of checking on a young wolf who had twisted his ankle during training. For an hour, at least, nobody looked at her like she was a scandal waiting to unfold. She was simply Elena, the healer, wrapping a bandage with careful, practiced hands, and the ordinary rhythm of the work steadied her more than she wanted to admit. It was there, in the infirmary, that she caught her first glimpse of Cade since the meeting in his study. He appeared in the doorway without warning, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed now in the simpler clothes of pack business, rather than the ceremonial robes of the night before. He looked for a moment, as though he had not expected to find her there, and something flickered across his face before the familiar coldness settled back into place. He said he had come to check on the injured wolf, a young warrior named Callum who served under him directly. Elena stepped back to let him examine the bandage she had just finished wrapping, and she watched, despite herself, as his manner shifted entirely in the presence of his warrior. He spoke to Callum with a warmth she had not seen from him at all, asking careful questions about the injury, promising the young man he would not be pushed back into training until the healer cleared him fully. There was patience in his voice, and something that almost resembled gentleness, and Elena found herself unexpectedly unsettled by the contrast between this version of him and the one who had barely looked at her in his study. When Callum left to rest, the room fell quiet, and for a long moment neither Elena nor Cade spoke. She busied herself with putting away supplies, refusing to be the one who broke the silence first. Finally, he said, in a voice quieter than before, that he had heard she agreed to the arrangement. She said she had, because she had not seen another reasonable option in front of her. He nodded slowly, and for just a moment she thought he might say something more, something that resembled an apology, or at least an acknowledgement of how difficult this was for her too. Instead, he simply thanked her for her cooperation, in a tone so formal it might as well have been directed at a stranger, and left the infirmary without another word. Elena stood alone among the shelves of bandages and tinctures for a long time after he had gone, staring at the empty doorway. She told herself she was not disappointed. She told herself she had not expected anything different, but some small, foolish part of her chest ached anyway, and she pressed her palm flat against it, the same way she pressed against a wound to slow its bleeding, and waited for the feeling to pass. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed in her new room, she thought about Marissa's words, about the mother who had left, and the hard father left behind. She thought about the warmth in Cade's voice when he spoke to his injured warrior, warmth that had never once been directed at her. She did not yet understand him. She was not sure she wanted to, but she understood, with growing certainty, that whatever waited ahead of her in this arrangement was not going to be simple, and she fell asleep, bracing herself for whatever came next. 3 days into her new life inside the pack hall, Elena learned that being called Luna in front of the pack and being treated as one behind closed doors were two entirely different things. The elders had insisted on a small gathering to formally present her, a quiet affair compared to the coronation itself, held in the same stone hall, but with far fewer torches lit and far fewer wolves in attendance. Elena stood beside Cade at the front of the room, while an elder named Griselda spoke the traditional words over them, words about partnership and strength, and the joining of two lives into one purpose. Elena repeated the responses she had been given, her voice steady even though her hands, hidden in the folds of her dress, were pressed tightly together to keep them from shaking. Cade stood beside her the entire time, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, and yet he might as well have been standing on the opposite side of the hall for all the warmth he showed her. He said his lines when required. He did not once look at her directly. When the ceremony ended, and the small crowd offered its polite applause, he stepped away from her side so quickly that anyone paying attention would have noticed the distance he was determined to keep. Afterward, in the privacy of the hallway outside the gathering room, Elena finally let some of her frustration show. She asked him, quietly enough that no passing servant would overhear, whether he intended to spend the entire arrangement refusing to even look at her, because if so, she wanted to know now, so she could plan accordingly. Cade's expression did not change, but something in his shoulders tightened. He said this arrangement was temporary, and that the less attachment they built between them now, the easier the eventual rejection would be for both of them. He said it as though he were discussing pack finances or border patrol schedules, some practical matter with no emotional weight attached at all, and that flat, businesslike tone stung more than open cruelty would have. Elena told him, evenly, that she appreciated his honesty, even if she did not appreciate being spoken to like a line item on a ledger. She walked away before he could respond, and she did not look back to see whether her words had landed. Over the following days, a strange rhythm settled between them. They shared meals in the formal dining hall when pack business required it, sitting at opposite ends of a table too long for comfortable conversation, exchanging only the words necessary to maintain appearances in front of the staff. Elena continued her work in the infirmary each morning, grateful for the hours she could spend away from the weight of her new role. Cade disappeared into meetings with the elders and the pack council, matters of territory and trade, and the upcoming autumn gathering that would bring representatives from every allied pack in the region. It was during one of these quiet mornings that Elena first heard the full story behind Cade's coldness, not from Marissa this time, but from an older healer named Delia, who had served the Thornwood Infirmary for over 30 years, and remembered the Ashford family long before Cade had ever taken his father's place. Delia had not intended to share the story. It slipped out during a slow afternoon while the two women sorted dried herbs into labeled jars, prompted by nothing more than Elena's quiet, unguarded comment that she did not understand why her mate seemed so determined to avoid caring for her at all. Delia set down the bundle of chamomile in her hands and was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. She said that Cade's father, the old Alpha, had been a proud man who believed weakness of any kind was a danger to a pack's survival, and that he counted love among the greatest weaknesses a leader could carry. He had taken a mate himself, a gentle woman named Rosalind, who came from a healing family much like Elena's own, and for a few years the household had seemed happy enough. But the old Alpha's pride and his temper had worn at that happiness slowly, the way water wears at stone, until Rosalind finally could not bear it any longer. She left Thornwood when Cade was 10 years old, slipping away in the night, much the way Elena herself would later slip away, though of course neither woman knew that yet. She never returned, and the old Alpha never spoke her name again, and neither, eventually, did anyone else in the pack, out of fear of his temper. Cade had grown up watching his father grow harder and colder in the years that followed, watching him drill into every young wolf under his command the same lesson he seemed to have learned from his wife's departure. That attachment made a person vulnerable, that love was a door left open for pain to walk through, and that a true leader kept every door in his heart locked tight. Delia said Cade had been a warm, curious child once, before all of that hardness settled over him like a second skin. She said she still remembered him running through the infirmary as a boy of 8, pestering the healers with questions about how bones healed and why some herbs worked faster than others, laughing easily in a way she had not seen from him since. Elena sat with that image for a long time after Delia finished speaking, the picture of a curious, laughing boy sitting strangely alongside the cold, guarded man she had come to know. She thought about the warmth she had glimpsed in his voice when he spoke to his injured warrior in the infirmary, proof that the capacity for gentleness had not entirely disappeared, only buried itself somewhere deep and difficult to reach. She thought about her own mother, gone now for different reasons entirely, and the ache of losing a parent early, and found herself feeling something dangerously close to sympathy for the man who had made her first days as his mate so painfully cold. She did not tell him she knew the story. She was not sure it was her place to bring up a wound he had clearly spent years trying to bury, and she was not foolish enough to think that sympathy alone would undo years of hardened habit. But she noticed, over the following days, that she began watching him differently, looking past the coldness for the moments where it cracked, however briefly. She noticed the way his jaw tightened when the elders pressed him about producing an heir, a subject he clearly found unbearable. She noticed the way his eyes lingered a beat too long on families walking together through the training yard, mothers and fathers watching their children spar, before he forced his attention elsewhere. None of it excused how he treated her. She reminded herself of that constantly, because it would have been easy, dangerously easy, to let sympathy soften her into someone who simply accepted poor treatment because she understood its origins. She had seen that pattern before, in patients who returned to the infirmary again and again with injuries they refused to explain, always finding some reason to excuse whoever had hurt them. She was determined not to become one of those stories herself. So even as her understanding of him deepened, her resolve held steady. She continued to meet his coldness with a composed, unbothered dignity that she suspected frustrated him more than open anger would have. She noticed him watching her sometimes across the dining hall, his expression unreadable, and she made a point of never looking away first, never giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. The turning point, small as it seemed at the time, came nearly 2 weeks into the arrangement, on an evening when a sudden autumn storm rolled in over the Thornwood territory. Elena had been called to the infirmary to tend to a young wolf caught out in the weather during patrol, his shoulder dislocated after a fall on the slick rocks near the eastern border. The injury was painful but not serious, and she worked quickly and calmly to set it back into place, murmuring steady reassurances the entire time. She did not notice Cade standing in the doorway until she had finished, and when she turned and found him there, soaked from the rain and clearly having come straight from checking the border patrols himself, something in his expression was different than she had seen before. He was not looking at her with coldness or careful distance. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they do not fully understand but cannot stop watching anyway. She asked him, carefully, if something was wrong. He said no, quickly, too quickly, and then admitted, in a voice rougher than his usual controlled tone, that he had come to check on the injured wolf and had simply stayed longer than intended, watching her work. He said it as though the admission surprised even him. Elena did not know what to say to that. For the first time since the coronation, the silence between them did not feel entirely cold. It felt, instead, like the space right before something shifted, though neither of them yet knew what that shift would bring, or whether it would lead them closer together, or push them even further apart. The injured wolf, sensing the strange tension in the room, made a quiet excuse about needing rest, and hurried out, leaving Elena and Cade alone among the shelves of bandages and drying herbs, the sound of rain drumming steadily against the infirmary roof. Elena busied herself with cleaning her instruments, giving her hands something to do so she would not have to decide what her face was showing. Cade remained in the doorway, dripping onto the stone floor, seemingly unwilling to either step further inside or turn and leave. Finally, he asked her a question that caught her off guard entirely. He asked how she had learned to stay so calm while setting a dislocated shoulder, since even seasoned warriors sometimes flinched at the sound the joint made when it slid back into place. It was such a small, ordinary question, nothing at all like the guarded exchanges they usually managed, and something about its simplicity made Elena's guard drop slightly before she could stop it. She told him the truth, that she had been terrified the first several times she performed the procedure, that her hands had shaken so badly during her training that her mentor once made her practice on a wooden model for an entire month before allowing her near an actual patient again. She said the calm he saw now was not something she had been born with. It was something she had built, slowly, through repetition and failure, and the stubborn refusal to give up simply because something frightened her. Cade was quiet for a moment, considering this, and then said, almost to himself, that he understood that kind of building better than she might expect. He did not elaborate, and Elena did not push him to, sensing that whatever memory sat behind the comment was not one he was ready to share. But the exchange, small as it was, felt like the first genuine conversation they had shared since the bond first appeared, and Elena found herself reluctant to let the moment end. She asked him, testing the waters carefully, whether he had always intended to become a healer's patient rather than a warrior himself, teasing gently at the fact that he seemed to spend a surprising amount of time in her infirmary for a man who claimed to want distance between them. For a moment, she worried she had overstepped, that the small warmth between them would collapse back into his usual guarded coldness. Instead, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough that she noticed it immediately. He said that as a boy he had, in fact, spent a great deal of time in the infirmary, though not as a patient. He said he used to sneak in whenever he could manage it, fascinated by how the healers worked, always asking questions until someone eventually shooed him back out to his lessons. Elena thought of Delia's story, the curious boy of 8 who had once run through these very halls asking why certain herbs worked faster than others, and she felt a small ache in her chest at hearing the memory confirmed directly from him, a piece of the boy still visible somewhere beneath the man he had become. She asked, gently, what had happened to that curiosity. The question landed heavier than she intended, and she watched Cade's expression shutter closed again almost instantly, the brief warmth retreating behind its familiar wall. He said only that a pack could not survive on curiosity alone, that leadership required a different kind of focus, and that he had learned, eventually, which parts of himself needed to be set aside for the good of Thornwood. Elena wanted to argue that curiosity and leadership were not opposites, that some of the best healers she had ever known led their patients through fear, precisely because they remained curious about what might help, rather than rigid in what they already assumed. But she recognized the shift in his posture, the subtle retreat, and decided this was not the moment to press further. Trust, she suspected, would have to be built slowly, the same way her steady hands had been built, through repetition rather than force. The rain continued outside, as Cade finally stepped further into the room, apparently deciding, wordlessly, that he was staying a while longer after all. He asked about her training, about how a girl from a modest family had come to be trusted with the health of an entire pack, and Elena found herself talking more freely than she had with anyone since arriving at the pack hall, describing the long nights of study, the mentor who had pushed her past her own doubts, the quiet satisfaction of watching a patient walk out healthy who had come in broken. For nearly an hour, they simply talked, careful and tentative, like two people testing the strength of a bridge before deciding whether it was safe to cross. Neither of them mentioned the bond directly. Neither of them mentioned the arrangement, or the elders, or the rejection Cade had promised was still coming eventually. For that one quiet hour, they were simply two people sheltering from a storm, discovering, almost against their will, that they did not entirely dislike each other's company. When the rain finally eased, and Cade excused himself to check on the border patrols one last time before retiring, he paused at the doorway and looked back at her, and for a moment, Elena thought he might say something more. Instead, he simply nodded, a small, formal gesture, and told her to sleep well before disappearing down the hallway. Elena stood alone in the infirmary for a long while afterward, listening to the last of the rain fade into a soft drizzle outside, turning the strange, unexpected evening over in her mind. She reminded herself sternly that one pleasant conversation did not undo weeks of coldness, that a man who had promised to reject her eventually should not be trusted simply because he had smiled, however briefly, at a shared memory. But some stubborn, hopeful part of her chest refused to fully listen to the warning, and she carried the memory of his almost smile with her all the way back to her room, turning it over like a smooth stone found unexpectedly along a familiar path. The warmth from that rainy evening in the infirmary did not last long, and Elena learned quickly that hope was a dangerous thing to carry inside the Thornwood pack hall. For a few days after the storm, something had felt different between them. Cade had lingered a little longer at meals. He had asked, once, whether she needed anything for her room, a question so small and ordinary that Elena had turned it over in her mind for hours afterward, searching for hidden meaning that probably was not there. She had allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that the walls between them might be beginning to soften, that the boy Delia remembered might still be reachable beneath the guarded man he had built himself into. Then the autumn council arrived early, moved up by nearly 2 weeks due to unrest along the northern border, and with it came a visiting delegation from the Ridgeline Pack, one of Thornwood's oldest allies. Among the delegation was a young she-wolf named Priya, the daughter of the Ridgeline Alpha, sent to represent her father's interests, and, as pack gossip immediately speculated, perhaps to explore a political alliance of a more personal nature as well. Elena first heard the whispers in the kitchens, carried to her second hand through Marissa, who delivered the news with visible reluctance, clearly not wanting to be the one to upset her. The Ridgeline Alpha, it was said, had hoped for years to strengthen ties between the two packs through marriage, and now that Thornwood had a new, unmated alpha, some among the older council members were quietly suggesting that Cade's inconvenient mating bond to a healer of no particular family standing should simply be set aside in favor of a more strategically valuable match. Elena told herself the rumor meant nothing, Bonds could not be undone by council preference, whatever political convenience the elders might wish for. But she also remembered, with a chill, that Cade himself had promised from the very first day that he intended to reject the bond eventually, once enough time had passed to protect his political standing. She had assumed that rejection, when it came, would happen quietly, privately, a formality handled behind closed doors. She had not considered that it might happen publicly, deliberately, as a message meant for an entire visiting delegation to witness. The autumn gathering itself was held on the third night after the delegation's arrival, a grand affair in the same stone hall where Elena had first felt the mating bond snap into place. Representatives from 4 allied packs filled the room, along with every member of the Thornwood Pack Council, and dozens of pack wolves eager to witness the diplomacy and spectacle of the evening. Elena attended at Cade's side, as expected of her role, wearing a deep green dress that Marissa had helped her choose, her hair pinned carefully away from her face. She had told herself she would hold her composure no matter what the evening brought, and she repeated that promise to herself again as the musicians began to play and the formal dancing started. She watched, from a chair near the edge of the hall, as Cade moved through the required courtesies of the evening, greeting each visiting alpha with the practiced formality of a man raised for exactly this purpose. She watched him speak briefly with Priya, who was, Elena had to admit privately, strikingly beautiful, with dark hair that fell in smooth waves and an easy, confident smile that suggested she was well accustomed to commanding attention in any room she entered. Elena did not think much of the brief exchange at first. Diplomatic courtesy required Cade to greet every visiting representative, and Priya was simply one among several. But as the evening progressed, she noticed the exchange happening again, and then a third time, each conversation lasting longer than the last, Cade's attention lingering on Priya in a way it had not lingered on any of the other visitors. Then the music shifted into a slower, more formal dance, the kind traditionally reserved for an alpha and his chosen partner, and Elena felt her stomach drop as she watched Cade cross the hall directly toward Priya, extending his hand with a formality that felt, to Elena's growing horror, deliberately staged. Priya accepted with visible delight, and the two of them moved into the center of the hall as every conversation around the room slowly quieted to watch. Elena sat frozen in her chair near the edge of the room, acutely aware of every eye that flicked toward her, gauging her reaction, waiting to see how the supposed Luna of Thornwood would respond to watching her mate dance with another woman in front of the entire assembled council. She made herself sit perfectly still. She made herself keep her expression composed, even pleasant, even as something inside her chest twisted painfully with every turn of the dance. Every moment, Cade's hand rested against Priya's waist, every low murmured word exchanged between them that Elena could not hear, but could easily imagine. She thought of every kind word Marissa had ever offered her, every quiet moment of connection with Delia in the infirmary, every fragile hope she had allowed herself to build over the past few weeks, and she felt each one crumbling beneath the weight of this single, deliberate humiliation. She understood, with sharp and painful clarity, exactly what Cade was doing. This was not simple diplomatic courtesy. This was a message, delivered as publicly as possible, meant for the council elders, who worried about his commitment to a mate of no particular standing, meant for the Ridgeline delegation, weighing whether an alliance through marriage was still possible, and meant, perhaps most cruelly of all, for Elena herself, a clear signal that whatever small warmth had passed between them during the storm meant nothing when weighed against political convenience. She sat through the entire dance without moving, without letting a single tear fall, without giving the watching crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. When the music finally ended, and Cade escorted Priya back to her seat with a small bow, Elena rose from her own chair with as much dignity as she could gather, and excused herself quietly, claiming a headache that nobody in the hall believed for even a moment. She made it as far as the hallway outside the great hall, before the composure she had held so carefully finally cracked. She pressed her back against the cool stone wall, and pressed her palm hard against her sternum, trying to slow the ragged, painful breaths that came too fast, trying to remind herself that this humiliation, however deeply it cut, was not something that could break bones or stop a heart. It only felt that way. She did not hear the footsteps approaching until Delia's voice spoke softly beside her, the old healer having apparently slipped out of the hall shortly after Elena herself. Delia did not offer meaningless comfort or false reassurance about Cade's intentions. She simply stood beside Elena in silence for a moment, and then said, quietly, that she had watched 2 generations of Ashford men make the same mistake, choosing pride and politics over the people who actually cared for them, and that watching a 3rd generation begin the pattern all over again was more than her old heart could bear to witness without saying something. Elena asked, her voice rougher than she wanted it to be, what exactly Delia thought she should do about it, since she had no power over council politics or alpha decisions, and certainly no power over which woman Cade chose to dance with in front of an entire delegation. Delia considered the question carefully before answering. She said that Elena did have power, more than she perhaps realized, because she had a choice about how much of herself she was willing to keep offering to a man determined to treat her as disposable. She said she had watched Rosalind, Cade's mother, endure years of similar treatment before finally deciding she would rather leave everything behind than continue shrinking herself to fit inside a marriage that offered her no respect. Delia said she was not suggesting Elena should run, not necessarily, but that she should not mistake patience for weakness, and she should never let anyone, alpha or otherwise, convince her that quiet suffering was the price of belonging somewhere. The words settled into Elena's chest like a seed planted in soil that had, until that moment, felt too hard and too dry to grow anything at all. She thanked Delia quietly and made her way back to her room, no longer bothering to hide the tears that finally fell freely once she was alone behind her closed door. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake for hours, replaying the image of Cade's hand at Priya's waist, the easy warmth he had shown a woman he barely knew, compared to the deliberate coldness he had shown the woman bound to him by instinct and blood. She thought about her own promise to herself, made on that very first night after the coronation, that she would not let this bond turn her into someone pathetic, someone who begged for scraps of affection from a man determined to withhold them. Somewhere in the depths of that long, sleepless night, a decision began to take shape, quiet and certain, the same way her hands had once learned to stay steady while setting a broken bone. She would not spend the coming weeks or months waiting anxiously to discover when and how Cade intended to formally reject her. She would not continue offering her dignity up piece by piece, hoping each small kindness he occasionally showed her might eventually add up to something real. She had built a life for herself once, out of nothing but stubbornness and skill, and she could build another one, somewhere far from Thornwood, somewhere the mating bond's painful pull might eventually fade into something bearable. She did not act on the decision immediately. There was still the matter of the rest of the autumn gathering to survive, still days of forced formality ahead of her, before she could reasonably slip away without immediately drawing suspicion. But the decision itself had settled into her chest with a strange, steady calm, the calm of a person who has finally stopped waiting for someone else to decide their fate and taken hold of the decision themselves. The following morning, she rose early and went about her usual work in the infirmary, as though nothing had changed, greeting patients with her usual steady warmth, mixing tinctures with her usual careful precision. Nobody watching her that day would have guessed that behind her calm exterior, she had already begun quietly planning her escape, counting the days until the delegation's departure would provide enough distraction for her to slip away unnoticed, mapping in her mind the fastest route out of the pack hall and into the surrounding forest. She caught sight of Cade only once that day, across the training yard, deep in conversation with the Ridgeline Alpha, and looking every bit the composed, capable leader the pack needed him to be. He did not look her way. She did not go out of her way to be seen. Whatever fragile connection had begun growing between them during that rainy evening in the infirmary, felt, in the harsh light of the morning after, like something she had imagined entirely, a hopeful story she had told herself, because the alternative, the reality of a man who would use her humiliation as a political tool, was simply too painful to accept. By the time evening fell again, Elena had already begun, quietly and carefully, to gather the few belongings she intended to take with her when the time finally came. She did not have long to sit with her plan in private, because 2 days later, an encounter she had not anticipated forced her hand sooner than she expected. She was crossing the eastern garden on her way back from the infirmary when she nearly walked directly into Priya, who was strolling the same path with 2 of her Ridgeline attendants, trailing a respectful distance behind her. Priya stopped and looked at Elena with an expression that was not unkind, exactly, but carried a curious, appraising quality that made Elena's skin prickle with discomfort. Priya introduced herself formally, as though the two of them had not already been the subject of every whispered conversation in the pack hall for days, and asked, with a directness Elena had not expected, how Elena was finding her new position as Luna. Elena answered carefully, choosing words that offered nothing for gossip to seize upon, saying only that adjusting to new responsibilities always took time. Priya studied her for a moment longer, then said, in a tone that seemed almost apologetic, that she hoped Elena did not think the dance 2 nights earlier had been her own idea. She said her father had been the one pushing hardest for closer ties with Thornwood, and that she herself found the entire political maneuvering exhausting, though she had learned long ago that an alpha's daughter rarely got to choose which dances she attended or with whom. The admission caught Elena off guard. She had spent 2 days imagining Priya as a willing participant in her humiliation, a beautiful, confident rival, eager to take advantage of a weak and unwanted bond. Hearing Priya describe herself instead as another woman maneuvered by political interests larger than her own wishes, complicated the anger Elena had been nursing, though it did nothing to soften what Cade himself had chosen to do. Elena asked, carefully, whether Priya had any personal interest in pursuing something further with the Thornwood Alpha, beyond what politics demanded of her. Priya considered the question seriously before answering, and said that Cade was certainly not without his appeal, but that she had noticed, even during their brief exchanges, a distance in him that suggested his heart was thoroughly occupied elsewhere, whatever his actions at the gathering might have suggested otherwise. She said she had grown up around enough political marriages to recognize the difference between a man calculating advantage and a man genuinely available, and in her judgment, Cade Ashford was very much the former during that dance, using her as a tool rather than pursuing her as a prospect. The observation should have offered Elena some comfort. Instead, it only sharpened her frustration, because it confirmed what she had already suspected, that Cade's cruelty at the gathering had been entirely deliberate, a calculated political move that cost him nothing personally, while costing Elena everything, in front of an audience of watching strangers. A man who simply found Priya attractive and pursued her honestly would have been easier, in some strange way, to forgive. A man who used another woman as a weapon against his own mate, fully aware of the pain it would cause, was something else entirely. Elena thanked Priya for her honesty and continued on her way, her thoughts churning, long after the brief conversation ended. She found herself, unexpectedly, developing something like respect for the Ridgeline Alpha's daughter, a woman navigating her own difficult position within the same tangled web of pack politics that had ensnared Elena herself. It was a small comfort, knowing that whatever Cade's intentions had been, Priya at least did not seem inclined to become his willing accomplice. That evening, Cade sought her out for the first time since the gathering, appearing at the door of her room just as she finished her evening meal alone, a tray delivered by kitchen staff, who no longer seemed to expect the two of them to dine together. He stood in the doorway with an expression she could not quite read, something caught between guilt and defensiveness, and asked if he could speak with her for a moment. Elena considered refusing him entirely. She considered telling him that whatever he had come to say could wait, or did not need to be said at all, since his actions 2 nights earlier had already communicated everything she needed to know about where she stood in his priorities. But some stubborn part of her, the same part that had once decided to walk into his study with her chin lifted rather than cowering, wanted to hear whatever excuse or explanation he had come to offer, if only so she could measure it honestly against what she had witnessed. She allowed him in, though she did not offer him a seat, and remained standing herself, arms crossed, waiting. Cade began by saying the dance had been necessary, that the council elders had been pressing him for weeks about strengthening ties with Ridgeline, and that a public display of continued diplomatic warmth had seemed, at the time, like the simplest way to ease their concerns without committing to anything more permanent. He said he had not considered how the gesture might appear from Elena's position in the room, watching. Elena asked him, her voice carefully level, whether he had truly not considered it, or whether he simply had not cared enough to weigh her feelings against his political calculations. The question landed harder than she intended, and she watched something flicker across his face, something that might have been genuine discomfort at being seen so clearly. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its usual controlled formality, and he admitted, haltingly, that he had known, on some level, that the dance would hurt her, and that he had chosen to do it anyway, because focusing on the political necessity felt easier than confronting what that choice actually cost. He said this was, apparently, a pattern he seemed determined to repeat, choosing the safety of calculation over the risk of anything that required him to actually care about the outcome for another person. It was, Elena realized, the closest thing to a genuine apology he had offered her since the bond first appeared, and some small, exhausted part of her wanted to accept it, to let the admission smooth over the sharp edges of her hurt. But she had spent 2 sleepless nights turning her decision over in her mind, examining it from every angle, and she was no longer willing to let a single moment of honesty undo weeks of calculated coldness. She told him, quietly but firmly, that understanding why he had hurt her did not erase the hurt itself, and that she was tired of being treated as a convenient tool whenever it suited pack politics, only to be offered small, grudging apologies afterward, as though that evened the balance. She said she did not know yet what she intended to do about the arrangement between them, but that she needed him to understand she was not going to keep accepting this pattern indefinitely, waiting patiently for whatever eventual rejection he had planned all along. Cade studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then said, quietly, that he did not actually know anymore what he intended regarding the eventual rejection he had promised on that very first day. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, and he left shortly after, without further explanation, as though he needed distance from his own uncertain words. Elena stood alone in her room long after he had gone, turning his admission over in her mind, alongside everything else that had happened over the past several days. She did not know what to make of a man who could hurt her so deliberately one moment, and then confess uncertainty about his own intentions the next. She only knew, with growing certainty, that she could not continue living inside this unpredictable rhythm of hope and hurt, waiting to discover which version of Cade Ashford she would encounter on any given day. Her decision from 2 nights earlier settled more firmly into place. She would give the arrangement a little more time, she told herself, if only to be certain she was not abandoning something real out of wounded pride. But the bag she had begun quietly packing remained ready beneath her bed, and she found herself, more and more, counting the days until the autumn delegation departed, and the pack haul returned to its normal rhythms, providing the cover she would need to finally slip away. The Ridgeline delegation stayed longer than Elena had hoped, extending their visit by nearly a week to finalize trade agreements that had apparently grown more complicated than anyone anticipated. Elena spent those extra days moving carefully through her routines, the infirmary in the mornings, quiet evenings alone in her room, watching from a careful distance as Cade navigated the ongoing negotiations with the same composed formality he brought to every aspect of his leadership. He did not seek her out again the way he had that night after the dance. Whatever uncertain admission had passed between them seemed to have retreated back behind his usual walls, and Elena found herself unsurprised by the reversal, even as some small, stubborn part of her had hoped it might mark the beginning of something different. She reminded herself, whenever that hope flickered, of Delia's warning about mistaking patience for weakness, and of her own promise not to keep offering pieces of herself to a man who seemed determined to withdraw them the moment real vulnerability was required. The final insult, when it came, arrived not through another public humiliation, but through something quieter, and, in some ways, more painful. The discovery of exactly how far Cade was willing to let political convenience shape his choices, even after everything that had passed between them. Elena learned of it by accident, overhearing a conversation she was never meant to hear. She had gone to the council chamber late one evening to retrieve a ledger she had left behind after a meeting about infirmary supplies, and found the room not empty as she expected, but occupied by Cade and 2 senior elders, their voices carrying through the partially open door before she could announce her presence. The elder named Griselda was speaking, her tone urgent, saying that the Ridgeline Alpha had made his position clear before departing. He remained willing to discuss a formal alliance through marriage with Priya, provided Cade's current mating bond was resolved cleanly and without lingering complication. Griselda argued that such an alliance would secure Thornwood's northern border for a generation, strengthen their standing among every allied pack in the region, and silence the council members still whispering doubts about Cade's readiness to lead. Elena stood frozen in the hallway, one hand pressed against the cool stone wall, waiting to hear how Cade would respond. His answer, when it came, was not the immediate firm refusal she had hoped for. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness Elena had not heard from him before. He said he understood the strategic value of what Griselda was proposing. He said he had spent his entire life being taught to weigh exactly these kinds of decisions, political value against personal cost, and that his father would have made this choice without a moment's hesitation. He did not say, clearly and directly, that he would refuse the proposal. He said only that he needed more time to consider it properly, given everything the pack currently had at stake. Elena did not wait to hear anything further. She turned and walked away from the council chamber as quietly as she had approached it, her chest tight with a hurt that felt, somehow, sharper than the public humiliation of the dance itself had been. That dance, she reminded herself, had at least come with an eventual, if incomplete, admission of guilt. This was different. This was Cade, in a private room where he believed no one who mattered was listening, failing to immediately reject a proposal that would require formally casting her aside in favor of political advantage. She did not sleep at all that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of the room she had come to think of as a temporary cage rather than a home, replaying Griselda's words and Cade's hesitant, non-committal response over and over, searching for some interpretation that might soften the blow. She could not find one. However she turned the conversation over in her mind, it always arrived at the same simple, painful conclusion, that when faced with a choice between honoring the bond that had claimed them both against their will and pursuing the marriage his father would have wanted, Cade had not been able to say, without hesitation, that he chose her. By morning, the decision that had been quietly taking shape in her mind for days finally crystallized into something firm and unshakable. She was done waiting to discover which version of this arrangement she would be handed on any given day. She was done hoping that small moments of warmth might eventually outweigh the pattern of calculated coldness that kept reasserting itself whenever politics demanded it. She had built a life for herself before the bond ever appeared, and she intended to build another one, somewhere far enough away that the constant uncertainty of waiting for Cade Ashford's rejection could no longer touch her. She spent that day moving through her usual routine with a strange, focused calm, the same steady composure she brought to setting a broken bone or stitching a difficult wound. She tended to her patients in the infirmary. She exchanged brief, pleasant words with Marissa over the midday meal, giving no indication of the decision solidifying inside her. She avoided Cade entirely, grateful that pack business kept him occupied with the final details of the Ridgeline delegation's departure, meetings that would likely stretch late into the evening. That evening, as the pack hall settled into its usual quiet rhythms, Elena began, methodically and without hesitation, to prepare for her departure. She retrieved the bag she had been quietly packing over the previous days and added the last few essential items: a change of clothes, a small collection of dried herbs and basic medical supplies she thought she might need, the modest savings she had accumulated over years of careful healing work, tucked into a pouch and hidden beneath her clothing. She did not plan to take anything Cade or the pack had given her since her arrival, none of the fine furniture or the borrowed dresses Marissa had helped her select. She wanted to leave exactly as she had arrived, carrying only what belonged to her before any of this began, as though she might somehow walk backward through the past several weeks and return to the simple, self-sufficient life she had built before a ceremony she never asked to attend upended everything she thought she understood about her own future. She considered, briefly, leaving some kind of note, some explanation for Cade or for Delia, or for Marissa, who had shown her genuine kindness throughout this difficult arrangement. In the end, she decided against it. A note would only invite questions, delay, perhaps even an attempt to stop her before she could get far enough away. She told herself that whatever explanation she owed anyone could be offered later, once she was safely beyond Thornwood's reach, if she ever chose to offer it at all. As she moved quietly around her room, gathering the last of her things by the dim light of a single candle, she found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of that rainy evening in the infirmary, of Cade's rough, surprised admission that he had simply wanted to keep watching her work. She thought of the almost smile that had touched his mouth when she teased him about spending so much time among the healers. She thought of the curious, laughing boy Delia had described, buried somewhere beneath the guarded man he had become, and felt a small, private grief for whatever might have grown between them if circumstances, and his own deeply rooted fear of attachment, had been different. She allowed herself exactly one moment to feel that grief fully, sitting on the edge of the bed with her packed bag beside her, before she pushed the feeling firmly aside. Grief, she reminded herself, was not a reason to stay somewhere that continued to hurt her. She had learned that lesson many times over in the infirmary, watching patients cling to situations and people that harmed them, simply because leaving felt frightening, or because some fragile hope convinced them things might eventually improve if they only waited a little longer. She was not going to become another version of that same story. Late that night, she heard Cade's footsteps in the hallway outside her room, returning at last from his lengthy meetings. And she went still, listening, half expecting him to knock, and half dreading it. He did not stop. His footsteps continued past her door and down the hall toward his own chambers, and she released a breath she had not realized she was holding, grateful, in that moment, for his continued distance, since it made what she was about to do considerably easier. She waited until the pack hall had settled fully into silence, until even the last late-night servants had finished their duties and retired for the evening, before she rose from the bed and checked, one final time, that everything she needed was secured in her bag. She moved to the window she had noticed weeks earlier, positioned above the old trellis that climbed the outer wall toward the training yard below, a route she had studied carefully over the past several days, without fully admitting to herself why she was memorizing it so thoroughly. She thought, one final time, of turning back, of unpacking her bag, and telling herself she was overreacting, that perhaps Cade simply needed more time to find his way past years of hardened fear. But she thought also of Griselda's voice through the partially open council chamber door, of Cade's hesitant, non-committal response, of a lifetime spent making herself smaller and more patient, in the hope that patience alone might eventually be enough to earn someone's full commitment. She had made her decision already. All that remained now was to carry it through. Before she reached the window, though, a soft knock sounded at her door, so quiet she almost mistook it for the settling of the old building around her. She froze, bag still slung over her shoulder, and considered simply staying silent until whoever it was gave up and went away. But the knock came again, and this time she recognized the light, careful rhythm of it as Marissa's particular way of announcing herself. Elena set the bag down quickly and crossed to the door, opening it just enough to see Marissa standing in the dim hallway, a shawl thrown over her nightclothes as though she had come straight from bed. Marissa's eyes flicked immediately to the packed bag visible on the floor behind Elena, and her expression shifted from sleepy concern to sudden, wide-awake understanding. For a moment neither of them spoke. Elena braced herself for questions, for arguments about the danger of traveling alone at night, for some attempt to talk her out of the decision she had spent days building toward. Instead, Marissa simply asked, quietly, whether Elena had eaten anything that evening, since the kitchens had cleared away the dinner trays hours ago, and a long journey was easier to face on a full stomach. The practical, unquestioning kindness of the question nearly undid the careful composure Elena had been holding on to all evening. She admitted she had not eaten, too consumed by nerves to think of food, and Marissa disappeared briefly down the hallway, returning a few minutes later with a small parcel of bread, dried meat, and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped carefully in cloth, along with a full water skin she had apparently filled from the kitchen well. Elena took the parcel with hands that trembled slightly, overwhelmed by the simple generosity of it. She asked Marissa, her voice barely above a whisper, whether she intended to tell anyone what she had seen. Marissa shook her head firmly, and said that whatever Elena needed to do to find some peace was her own business, and that she had watched this pack chew up too many good people already to feel any loyalty toward stopping one more from choosing a different path. She said only that Elena should be careful, that the forest beyond Thornwood's borders held dangers of its own, and that she hoped, whatever happened, Elena would find somewhere safe to land. The two women embraced briefly in the doorway, and Elena felt a fresh wave of grief at the thought of leaving behind the handful of genuine connections she had managed to build during her time in the pack hall. Marissa had shown her nothing but honest kindness since the moment the bond first appeared, and Delia had offered wisdom that Elena suspected she would carry with her for the rest of her life, wherever that life eventually led. She promised herself, quietly, that if circumstances ever allowed it, she would find some way to properly thank them both. After Marissa slipped back down the hallway toward her own quarters, Elena closed the door softly and returned her attention to the window, her resolve, if anything, strengthened rather than shaken by the brief encounter. She checked the parcel of food and tucked it securely into her bag, alongside her other supplies, grateful for the practical foresight that would make the first stretch of her journey considerably easier. She allowed herself one final look around the room that had served as her temporary quarters for these past weeks, taking in the fine furniture and the wide window overlooking the training yard, all of it dressed up to look like a gift while functioning, in practice, as a gilded cage. She thought briefly of the version of herself who had first stood in this room on her very first night, uncertain and freshly humiliated, wondering how many months it would take before the bond either grew into something real or was cut away entirely. That question, at least, had finally been answered, even if not in the way either of them had originally expected. With her bag secured over her shoulder and her heart pounding steadily in her chest, Elena moved toward the window, ready to leave the Thornwood pack hall and the uncertain, painful arrangement it had trapped her inside, behind her for good. The window latch would not move, and Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, louder than any sound in the sleeping pack hall around her. She pressed her palm flat against the old wooden frame and pushed with steady, controlled force, refusing to let panic rush her into a mistake. The latch finally gave way with a soft crack, quieter than she had feared, and cool night air rushed into the room, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine from the storm that had passed through days earlier. Elena paused, listening for any sign that the sound had drawn attention, and when the hallway outside her door remained silent, she allowed herself a slow, careful breath before easing the window open the rest of the way. The trellis below her window had seemed sturdier from a distance, viewed casually during her walks through the training yard over the past several days. Up close, gripping the aged wood with both hands as she swung one leg over the sill, it felt considerably less reliable. Elena tested her weight against the lowest rung within reach, felt it hold, and began her careful descent, moving slowly enough to keep her balance but quickly enough to minimize the time she spent exposed against the outer wall of the pack hall, visible to anyone who happened to glance up from the grounds below. Halfway down, a section of the trellis groaned under her weight, and Elena froze completely, pressing herself as flat as possible against the wall, waiting for the sound to fade into the surrounding quiet. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, and closer by, she could hear the low murmur of voices from the direction of the front gate, where the night guards kept their usual posts. She waited until her pulse settled slightly, before continuing her descent, testing each rung carefully, before trusting it with her full weight. Her feet finally touched solid ground at the base of the trellis, and she crouched low in the shadow of the wall for a moment, catching her breath and getting her bearings. The training yard stretched out ahead of her, moonlit and empty at this late hour, the packed earth pale beneath a sky mostly clear now that the storm clouds had finally moved on. Beyond the training yard lay the outer wall, and beyond that, the dense tree line of the forest that marked the edge of Thornwood's protected territory. Elena had spent the past several evenings, under the pretense of taking quiet walks to clear her head, carefully studying the patrol patterns of the wolves stationed around the pack hall's perimeter. She knew, from careful observation, that the guards rotated their positions roughly every hour, and that a narrow gap existed near the eastern section of the outer wall, close to where an old drainage culvert ran beneath the stones, wide enough for a person to slip through if they moved quickly and quietly during the brief window between rotations. She checked the position of the moon against what she remembered of the guards' typical timing and judged she had perhaps 10 minutes before the next rotation began. Moving low and fast across the open training yard, staying close to the shadows cast by the equipment racks along its edge, she made her way toward the eastern wall, every sense alert for any sign that she had been spotted. She reached the drainage culvert without incident, and dropped to her knees to examine the gap she had identified during her earlier observations. It was narrower than she remembered, and for one heart-stopping moment she worried her bag would not fit through alongside her. She slid the bag off her shoulder and pushed it through first, then followed after it, scraping her arm against the rough stone edge hard enough to sting but not hard enough to slow her down. On the other side of the wall, the forest rose up dark and dense before her, and Elena felt a surge of something that was not quite relief, but was close enough to it that her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her bag and got to her feet. She was outside Thornwood's protected boundary now, standing in territory where pack law technically still applied, but enforcement grew considerably thinner the further one traveled from the pack hall itself. she did not allow herself to linger. She knew the guards would eventually notice her absence, likely not until morning if she was fortunate, since her role as a healer meant nobody expected to see her at every meal or every pack function, and the fewer questions raised before dawn, the greater her head start would be. She oriented herself using the stars, a skill her mentor had insisted every healer learn in case they were ever called to travel at night to reach a distant patient, and began walking briskly in the direction of Millhaven, the neutral border town she had heard mentioned occasionally by traveling merchants who passed through Thornwood's markets. The forest at night was not silent, though Elena had expected it to be. It hummed with the small sounds of nocturnal creatures moving through the underbrush, the distant call of owls, the creak of branches shifting in the light breeze that had followed the storm's departure. She kept her pace steady and her senses alert, remembering every piece of practical wilderness knowledge she had ever absorbed, deliberately avoiding the well-worn paths that pack patrols might use, and instead, cutting a careful course through denser undergrowth that would be harder for any pursuer to track quickly. An hour into her journey, exhaustion began creeping into her legs, and she allowed herself a brief pause beside a fallen log to catch her breath and eat a small portion of the food Marissa had given her. She checked the position of the moon again, judging she had covered a reasonable distance already, though Millhaven itself remained a full day's travel away by her best estimate, assuming she kept moving at a steady pace through the following day as well. She thought, as she sat catching her breath in the quiet darkness, of the moment months from now when someone might finally notice her absence at the pack hall, whether that discovery would come at dawn when she failed to appear in the infirmary, or perhaps sooner, if some restless servant happened to check her room during the night. She thought of Cade's reaction to the news, and found she could not quite predict what shape that reaction might take. Would he feel relief, she wondered, that the inconvenient bond, binding him to a healer of no particular standing, had resolved itself without requiring him to be the one to formally reject her? Or would some other feeling entirely surface, something closer to what Delia had described as buried curiosity and warmth, however deeply he had learned to bury it? She pushed the questions aside, unwilling to let speculation about Cade's reaction slow her resolve now, after everything it had taken to get this far. Whatever he felt upon discovering her absence was no longer her concern. She had made her choice, and she intended to see it through completely. She resumed walking as soon as her breath steadied, moving deeper into the forest as the night wore on. Around what she judged to be the middle hours of the night, the terrain grew rougher, the ground rising into a series of low, rocky hills that slowed her progress considerably. She picked her way carefully over uneven ground, grateful for the sturdy boots she had thought to wear, rather than the softer shoes more common among pack hall staff, and pressed onward, despite the growing ache in her legs, and the fatigue settling heavier into her limbs with every passing hour. It was during this stretch, navigating the rocky hills, that she first became aware of a sound behind her that did not belong to the ordinary rhythm of the forest at night. She stopped, straining to listen, and heard it again. The distant, distinct sound of something moving quickly through the underbrush, following a path roughly parallel to her own. Her heart lurched, and she pressed herself into the shadow of a large boulder, waiting, listening for any further indication of what might be tracking her. The sound did not repeat immediately, and after several long, tense minutes, she convinced herself it had likely been nothing more than a deer or some other forest creature startled by her passage, and forced herself to continue moving, though her pace quickened considerably, driven now by a fresh urgency that had nothing to do with her earlier fatigue. The remainder of the night passed in a blur of careful, exhausting travel, Elena pushing herself forward through the darkness, with a stubborn determination that surprised even herself. By the time the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the trees overhead, she had put a considerable distance between herself and Thornwood, though her legs ached fiercely, and her eyes burned with the need for sleep she had not allowed herself. She found a small clearing as the sun began properly rising, sheltered by a dense stand of trees that offered some concealment, and decided the risk of continuing without rest outweighed the benefit of pushing forward exhausted and careless. She ate another small portion of the food Marissa had packed, drank sparingly from her water skin, and settled into the shelter of a large tree root system to rest for a few hours before continuing her journey in daylight, when travel would be somewhat easier despite the increased risk of being spotted. As exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, her last coherent thought was of the pack haul she had left behind, of the window she had climbed through, and the trellis that had held her weight just long enough, and of the strange, aching pull in her chest that the mating bond continued to exert, even now, hours and miles away from the man who carried its other half. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that distance alone might begin to ease that pull. Instead, as she drifted toward an uneasy sleep in the dawn-lit clearing, the ache seemed, if anything, to have grown sharper, a constant, low reminder that whatever she had escaped in Thornwood, the bond itself had traveled with her every step of the way. She woke a few hours later to full daylight filtering through the canopy above her, and for one disoriented moment, she forgot entirely where she was, her body stiff and sore from sleeping curled against the tree roots. Memory returned quickly, and with it a fresh surge of urgency. She sat up, rubbing the ache from her neck, and assessed her surroundings carefully, before allowing herself to relax even slightly. The forest around her clearing seemed undisturbed, no sign of pursuit, no lingering sounds of anything larger than birds moving through the branches overhead. She allowed herself a small measure of relief, gathered her belongings, and ate another modest portion of her dwindling supplies before setting off again, this time in full daylight, which made navigation considerably easier, but also made her considerably more visible to anyone who might be searching for her. The terrain grew gentler as the morning wore on, the rocky hills giving way to a wide, shallow valley threaded through with a clear running stream. Elena followed the stream for a time, grateful for the easy access to fresh water, refilling her water skin and splashing the cool liquid over her face and neck to wash away some of the grime and exhaustion of the previous night's travel. She caught her own reflection briefly, in a still pool near the stream's edge, and barely recognized the woman looking back at her, hair tangled and loose from its pins, a smear of dirt along one cheekbone, eyes shadowed with fatigue, but carrying an expression of fierce, unshakable resolve that surprised her when she noticed it. Around midday, she encountered the first real evidence that she was no longer entirely alone in the forest. She had stopped to rest briefly on a fallen log near the stream when she caught, faint but unmistakable, the sound of that same rapid movement through underbrush she had noticed the night before, this time close enough that she could tell it was following the general direction of the stream, roughly paralleling her own path, just as it had hours earlier. She rose quickly, adrenaline flooding through her exhausted limbs, and moved off the exposed stream bank into the denser tree cover, crouching low behind a thick cluster of ferns. She waited, barely breathing, straining every sense to identify whatever was tracking her. Long minutes passed in tense silence, and then, faintly, she heard it again, further off this time, moving away rather than closer, and she allowed herself to exhale slowly. She told herself it was likely nothing more than a deer or a fox, startled repeatedly by her own passage through the forest, the same explanation she had offered herself the night before. But some instinctive part of her, the part connected to the mating bond she could not simply reason away, whispered a different possibility entirely, one she was not yet ready to fully consider. She pushed the thought aside and continued moving, increasing her pace despite her tired legs, driven now by a wariness that made every rustle of leaves and snap of twig underfoot feel weighted with significance. The afternoon brought new challenges as the terrain shifted again, the gentle valley giving way to a stretch of dense, thorny undergrowth that tore at her clothes and scratched her arms as she pushed through it, unable to find an easier route around the tangled growth without adding significant time to her journey. By the time she emerged on the other side, her arms bore several shallow scratches, and her dress, already stained from the previous night's travel, hung torn along one hem. She pressed on regardless, comforting herself with the knowledge that according to her calculations, she should reach the outskirts of Millhaven before nightfall, if her pace held steady. The thought of a warm meal, a proper bed, and the relative safety of a town beyond direct pack jurisdiction kept her moving through the worst of her exhaustion, one careful step after another. As the afternoon light began to slant lower through the trees, signaling the approach of evening, Elena finally caught her first glimpse of Millhaven in the distance, a scatter of rooftops and rising smoke visible through a gap in the tree line ahead. Relief flooded through her, so intense it nearly buckled her knees, and she quickened her pace toward the welcoming sight, eager to finally put solid walls and a locked door between herself and whatever uncertainty the forest still held. The final stretch of forest before the town's edge proved easier going, the underbrush thinning, as the trees gave way gradually to cultivated fields belonging to farms on Millhaven's outskirts. Elena kept to the tree line as long as possible, wary of drawing attention from anyone who might recognize her as a Thornwood pack member traveling alone and unescorted, before finally emerging onto a worn dirt road that clearly led toward the town's main gate. She joined the road cautiously, falling into step at a respectable distance behind a farmer's cart making its own way toward town, using the presence of another traveler to make her own arrival appear less conspicuous. Her legs trembled with fatigue by the time the town's outer buildings came properly into view. Modest wooden structures with smoke curling from their chimneys. The sounds of ordinary evening life beginning to drift toward her on the cooling air. Voices calling to each other. The clatter of pots. Somewhere in the distance the bright, ordinary sound of children laughing at some game. It was, Elena thought, the most welcome sound she had heard in a very long time. Proof that somewhere beyond the reach of pack politics and mating bonds and calculated humiliation, ordinary life continued exactly as it always had, indifferent to everything she had just survived to reach it. She straightened her spine, adjusted her torn dress as best she could, and walked the final stretch of road into Millhaven, with her chin lifted, determined to begin, however roughly, the next chapter of a life that finally, for the first time in weeks, belonged entirely to her. Millhaven welcomed Elena the way most border towns welcome strangers, with cautious curiosity rather than open suspicion, since a town that survived on trade between packs and independent travelers alike could not afford to turn away every unfamiliar face that wandered through its gates. She spent her first night in a small, cramped room above the town's only tavern, paying for the space with a portion of the modest savings she had carried with her from Thornwood. The room was far from luxurious, little more than a narrow bed and a wash basin crowded beneath a sloped ceiling, but after the exhausting journey through the forest, it felt like the finest accommodation she had ever known. She slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in weeks, her body finally allowed to rest without the constant low hum of tension that had followed her through every day at the pack hall. She woke the next morning with aching muscles and a clearer head than she had experienced in a long time, and set about the practical business of building a life for herself in this unfamiliar place. She had never intended to stay at the tavern long term, both because of the cost and because the constant flow of travelers through its common room made her feel uncomfortably exposed. Her first task, she decided, was to find steadier lodging and, more importantly, steady work that would allow her savings to last while she established herself properly. She found both within the same day, through a stroke of fortune that felt, to Elena, like the first genuinely good thing to happen to her in longer than she cared to admit. Wandering through Millhaven's modest market square that morning, she noticed a small apothecary shop tucked between a leatherworker and a bakery, its window display crowded with dried herbs, glass bottles, and neatly labeled jars that immediately caught her professional attention. She stepped inside on impulse, drawn by the familiar, comforting scent of medicinal herbs that reminded her sharply of the Thornwood Infirmary, though without any of the painful associations that place now carried for her. The shop belonged to an older woman named Odette, a widow who had run the apothecary alone since her husband's passing several years earlier, and who greeted Elena's polite inquiries about her stock with the weary patience of someone accustomed to curious visitors who rarely became paying customers. When Elena, examining the shelves with obvious professional interest, began asking more specific questions about certain preparations, and pointed out, gently, that one of the labeled tinctures had likely lost much of its potency due to improper storage, away from direct light, Odette's weary patience shifted quickly into sharp, focused attention. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, Odette peppering Elena with increasingly specific questions to test the depth of her knowledge, questions about herb combinations, about treating fevers in wolves versus treating them in ordinary humans, who occasionally pass through Millhaven's markets, about the proper technique for setting various types of fractures. Elena answered each question thoroughly and honestly, drawing on years of training and practical experience, and by the end of their conversation, Odette had made her an offer that felt, to Elena, almost too fortunate to be real, a position assisting in the apothecary, along with a small but comfortable room above the shop itself, in exchange for her healing knowledge and her willingness to help manage the growing number of patients who sought Odette's help for injuries and illnesses beyond simple remedies. Elena accepted before Odette had even finished fully describing the arrangement, relief washing over her so completely that she had to blink back unexpected tears in front of her new employer. Odette, apparently no stranger to reading the signs of someone running from a difficult past, did not press for explanations. She simply nodded, satisfied, and told Elena to fetch her belongings from the tavern before evening, since the back room above the shop had been sitting empty far too long and could use someone in it again. The room above the apothecary was small but clean, with a single window overlooking the modest garden Odette maintained behind the shop, full of herbs and medicinal plants that Elena recognized immediately, and several unfamiliar varieties she looked forward to learning about. It was nothing like the fine, spacious room she had occupied in the Thornwood Pack Hall, and Elena found she preferred it enormously, precisely because of that difference. This room, however modest, belonged entirely to her, earned through her own skill and effort, rather than granted, as part of an arrangement she had never asked for. Over the following days, Elena settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely her own. She woke early each morning to help Odette open the shop, spent her days measuring out tinctures and treating the steady stream of patients who came through the apothecary's door, and spent her evenings tending the herb garden or reading through Odette's modest but well-curated collection of healing texts, several of which covered techniques Elena had never encountered during her training at Thornwood. She found she was good at this work in a way that felt different from her role back at the Pack Infirmary, not because her skills had changed, but because here, in Millhaven, she was simply Elena the healer, valued entirely for her competence and her care, with no complicated politics or painful bonds tangled into every interaction. Patients thanked her sincerely for her help and went on their way, and she felt, with each small success, a piece of her confidence and sense of self slowly rebuilding itself, after weeks of feeling reduced to nothing more than a political inconvenience. Odette, for her part, proved to be exactly the kind of steady, undemanding presence Elena needed during this period of rebuilding. She asked no questions about Elena's past, offered no unsolicited opinions about whatever circumstances had brought a clearly skilled and clearly troubled young healer to her shop door, and simply treated Elena with the same brisk, practical respect she extended to every capable worker. Elena found herself grateful, more than she could easily express, for that unquestioning acceptance. The people of Millhaven, too, welcomed her gradually into their community. She became a familiar face at the market square, exchanging pleasant greetings with the baker next door and the leather worker on the shop's other side, slowly building the kind of easy, ordinary connections that had never quite been possible for her back at Thornwood, where her identity had always been tangled up with pack politics in ways that made genuine friendship complicated. Here, nobody looked at her and thought immediately of scandal or gossip. She was simply the new healer's assistant, quietly capable and quietly kind, and that simple, unremarkable identity felt like a gift after everything she had left behind. Despite the steady rebuilding of her life in Millhaven, though, Elena could not escape one persistent, unwelcome reminder that her past had not fully released its hold on her. The mating bond, which she had hoped might fade with distance, the way an old injury eventually stopped aching, showed no sign of loosening its grip at all. If anything, the ache in her chest seemed to grow sharper as the days passed, a constant, low throb that intensified during quiet moments, when her hands were not occupied with work and her mind had space to wander back toward Thornwood, despite her every effort to keep it firmly focused on her new life. She experienced the ache most acutely at night, lying alone in her small room above the apothecary, staring up at the sloped ceiling and fighting against the unwelcome pull that seemed to tug steadily at something deep inside her chest, as though her very instincts were straining toward a direction she refused to travel. She had heard, vaguely, during her training, that separated mates sometimes experienced physical discomfort as the bond struggled against the distance forced upon it, but she had never expected the sensation to feel quite this persistent, quite this difficult to simply ignore through sheer force of will. She mentioned it once, carefully and without full explanation, to Odette during a quiet evening in the shop, describing only a general, unexplained ache that seemed to worsen rather than improve with time. Odette, who had clearly seen enough of the world to recognize the symptoms of a strained mating bond even without Elena spelling it out directly, studied her for a long moment before saying simply that some wounds took considerably longer to heal than others, and that time alone was not always sufficient medicine for every kind of hurt. She did not press further, and Elena did not offer more detail, grateful once again for her employer's unusual restraint. Despite the persistent ache, Elena refused to let it derail the progress she had made. She reminded herself, whenever the pull grew particularly strong, of every reason she had left Thornwood in the first place: the humiliation of the dance, the overheard conversation about the proposed marriage to Priya, the years of calculated coldness punctuated only occasionally by fragile moments of warmth that never seemed to last. Whatever physical discomfort the distance cost her, she told herself firmly, it was a smaller price to pay than the alternative, continuing to live inside an arrangement that eroded her dignity a little more with every passing week. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival in Millhaven, Elena found herself treating a young mother named Willa, who had come into the apothecary, seeking something to ease her infant daughter's persistent cough. As Elena carefully measured out a gentle honey-based remedy, explaining the correct dosage in a soft, reassuring voice, she caught Willa watching her with an expression of quiet gratitude that struck something deep and unexpected inside her chest. Willa mentioned, almost in passing, that she and her husband had left their own pack territory 2 winters earlier, tired of politics and hierarchy that never seemed to value ordinary families the way it valued alliances and bloodlines. She said Millhaven had given them something they had never quite found within pack walls: the freedom to simply live, to raise their daughter without the constant pressure of pack expectation weighing on every decision they made. She said it with such simple, unguarded contentment that Elena found herself unexpectedly moved, recognizing in Willa's words an echo of exactly what she herself had been searching for since the night she climbed out of her window at the Thornwood Pack Hall. After Willa left with her remedy, and her daughter's cough already sounding slightly less troubled, Elena stood behind the apothecary counter for a long moment, turning the conversation over in her mind. She thought about how effortlessly Willa had described choosing a different life, without any lingering ache of regret or longing for what she had left behind. Elena wondered, with a flicker of something close to envy, whether she might ever reach that same place of easy contentment, or whether the persistent pull of the mating bond would forever mark her as someone caught between 2 lives, belonging fully to neither. She raised the question with Odette later that evening, as the 2 women closed up the shop for the night, framing it carefully as a general curiosity about separated bonds, rather than a personal confession. She asked whether Odette had ever known of a bond that simply faded entirely with enough time and distance, allowing both parties to move forward completely unburdened by what had once connected them. Odette considered the question seriously, wiping down the counter with slow, thoughtful movements before answering. She said she had known a few such cases over her many years running the apothecary, mates who separated and eventually found real peace apart from one another. But she said, honestly, that those cases were the exception rather than the rule, and that in her experience, a true mating bond rarely faded entirely, however much distance or time was placed between 2 people. She said the bond tended instead to settle into something quieter, more bearable, but it remained, in her observation, a permanent thread woven into a person's instincts, impossible to fully unravel no matter how determined someone was to try. The answer was not the reassurance Elena had hoped for, but she found she appreciated Odette's honesty more than she would have appreciated a comfortable lie. She thanked her employer for the candid answer and retreated to her small room above the shop, sitting for a long while beside her window, watching the last light fade from the herb garden below, turning Odette's words over in her mind, alongside the ache in her chest that refused, stubbornly, to lessen no matter how full she kept her days, or how contentedly she settled into her new routine. She thought, that evening, of Cade for the first time in several days without deliberately forcing the memory away. She wondered whether he had noticed her absence yet, whether news of her departure had spread through the pack the way news always seemed to spread through Thornwood, fast and merciless and impossible to contain. She wondered, briefly and against her own better judgment, what expression might have crossed his face upon learning she was gone, whether it carried relief or something else entirely, something closer to what Delia had once suggested still lived buried beneath his careful walls. She caught herself in the wondering and pushed it firmly aside, reminding herself that whatever Cade felt upon discovering her absence was no longer any concern of hers. She had built something real here in Millhaven, however modest, and she intended to keep building it, one steady day at a time, Regardless of what ache the bond continued to press against her chest, regardless of what unfinished business might still linger, unresolved, back within the walls of the pack hall she had left behind. She did not yet know how quickly that unfinished business was about to come looking for her. Cade did not learn of Elena's disappearance until well past midday, and by the time he did, the news had already torn through the Thornwood pack hall like fire through dry brush. It began with Marissa, who had gone to deliver Elena's morning tray, as she did every day, only to find the room empty, the bed neatly made, and the window standing open, with the old trellis below it bearing clear signs of recent use. Marissa, true to the promise she had made Elena, did not raise an alarm herself, but she was not the only person with access to the household's daily routines, and within an hour, a junior staff member had noticed the same open window, and, lacking Marissa's discretion, mentioned it to one of the senior guards. By the time word reached Cade, delivered by a visibly nervous elder who clearly did not relish being the messenger, the story had already grown and shifted through several retellings, but the core of it remained unmistakable. Elena was gone, and she had left through her window, rather than through any of the hall's guarded doors, a detail that made the departure impossible to interpret as anything other than deliberate. Cade had been in the middle of a council meeting regarding the final terms of the Ridgeline trade agreement when the news reached him. Griselda would later describe, to anyone who would listen, the way his expression had changed the instant the elder finished speaking, a stillness settling over him that was somehow more alarming than any outburst could have been. He did not shout. He did not immediately demand explanations or send warriors scrambling in every direction. He simply rose from his chair, excused himself from the meeting with a few clipped words, and walked directly to Elena's room, as though some part of him needed to confirm the news with his own eyes before he could allow himself to believe it. He found the room exactly as Marissa had described it, tidy, undisturbed, except for the open window. Every trace of Elena's fine furniture and borrowed dresses left untouched, as though she had taken pains to leave with nothing that had not belonged to her before she ever arrived. Cade stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the details, and something in his chest, some carefully maintained barrier he had spent years reinforcing, cracked audibly enough that he could feel it happening, a physical sensation like a bone shifting out of place. He crossed to the window and examined the trellis below, noting the marks that confirmed someone had indeed climbed down using it recently. He noted, too, the direction the marks in the soft earth beneath the window seemed to lead, toward the eastern section of the outer wall, rather than the front gate, and something cold and sharp settled into his stomach as he recognized the deliberate care in the route she had chosen, evidence that she had planned this departure carefully, rather than fleeing in a moment of panic. He returned to the council chamber only briefly, long enough to inform the assembled elders that the meeting was concluded for the day, and that he required their full attention on a different matter entirely. Griselda, sensing something dangerous in his tone, asked cautiously what had happened. Cade told them, flatly, that his mate had left the pack hall sometime during the previous night, and that he intended to find her. The reaction among the elders was immediate and varied. Some expressed concern for Elena's safety, given the dangers of traveling alone through unprotected forest. Others, more focused on political consequence, began immediately calculating how the disappearance of a mate might be spun favorably in light of the still open possibility of an alliance with Ridgeline, a calculation Cade found himself, unexpectedly, unable to stomach hearing spoken aloud. He cut Griselda off mid-sentence as she began outlining exactly this line of reasoning, his voice sharper than anyone in the room had heard from him since his coronation, and told her plainly that he had no interest in discussing political advantage while his mate was somewhere alone in the forest, unprotected. The room fell silent at the force behind his words, and Cade himself seemed startled by his own vehemence, standing for a moment, with his jaw tight and his hands clenched at his sides, as though only now fully registering the depth of what he was feeling. He left the council chamber without further explanation and made his way to the training yard, where several of his most trusted warriors were finishing their midday drills. He gathered them quickly, explaining the situation in clipped, efficient terms, and began organizing a search that would cover every likely route Elena might have taken from Thornwood's grounds. His second-in-command, a steady, capable warrior named Griffin, who had served under Cade's father before him, listened carefully to the instructions, and then asked, quietly enough that the others could not overhear, whether Cade was certain he wanted to lead the search personally, rather than delegating it entirely to the warriors, better trained for wilderness tracking. Cade's answer came without hesitation, and it surprised even him with its intensity. He said he was not delegating this particular task to anyone, that he intended to track Elena himself, and that Griffin should organize additional search parties to cover the remaining routes while he pursued what he believed, based on the direction of her tracks near the outer wall, was the most likely path she had taken toward the neutral territories. Griffin studied him for a long moment, an expression crossing his weathered face that Cade could not quite read, something between surprise and quiet approval. He said only that he would see the additional parties organized within the hour, and turned to carry out the instructions without further comment. As the warriors dispersed to prepare for the search, Cade found himself alone briefly near the training yard's edge, and it was there that the full weight of what he was feeling finally caught up with him. He had spent years training himself to control every emotional response, to weigh every decision through the cold, careful lens his father had drilled into him since childhood. But standing there, imagining Elena alone in the forest, possibly injured, possibly frightened, possibly in real danger from any number of threats that roamed unprotected territory, he felt something rise up inside him that he could not immediately name, something violent and desperate that pushed hard against the careful control he had maintained his entire adult life. He felt his own wolf straining beneath his skin, closer to the surface than it had come in years, and for one alarming moment, he genuinely feared he might lose the fight to keep his human form entirely, a loss of control that would have deeply embarrassed him in front of his warriors just weeks into his time as Alpha. He forced himself to breathe slowly, deliberately, the way he had been taught as a young wolf still learning to manage his shifts, and gradually, the worst of the surge subsided, though the underlying urgency remained, sharp and insistent, driving him toward action, rather than the calm, calculated patience he usually prided himself on. Griffin found him a short while later, having overseen the assembly of the search parties, and noticed immediately the tension still visible in Cade's shoulders and the barely restrained energy in his stance. He said carefully that he had known Cade since he was a boy still small enough to be lifted onto his father's shoulders during pack gatherings, and that he had never once seen him look the way he looked right now, not even during the difficult months following his father's death. Cade did not answer immediately, staring off toward the eastern wall, where Elena's tracks had led, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness that surprised them both. He said he did not entirely understand what he was feeling, that he had spent years convincing himself he did not want a mate, that attachment of any kind was a vulnerability he could not afford as Alpha, and yet here he was, ready to abandon every ounce of careful calculation he had ever practiced, simply to track down a woman he had known for barely a month. Griffin listened without interrupting, and when Cade finished speaking, he said something that would stay with Cade for a long time afterward. He said he had served Cade's father for over 20 years, long enough to watch the old Alpha grow colder and harder with every passing season after Rosalind left, and that he had always privately believed the old Alpha's greatest failure was not losing his mate, but refusing to admit, even to himself, how much her absence had hollowed him out. Griffin said Cade had spent his whole life determined not to become his father, and yet the pattern he had been building with Elena, the coldness, the calculated distance, the public humiliation at the autumn gathering that half the pack was still quietly discussing, looked, to Griffin's experienced eye, uncomfortably similar to exactly the pattern he had sworn to avoid. Cade absorbed this in silence, his expression unreadable, and Griffin, apparently satisfied that his words had landed even if Cade offered no immediate response, excused himself to check on the readiness of the search parties, leaving Cade alone once more with his own uncomfortable thoughts. Standing there in the fading afternoon light, Cade allowed himself, for perhaps the first time since the coronation, to fully examine the fear that had driven every guarded, cold decision he had made regarding Elena since the bond first appeared. He thought of his mother's face, faded now in his memory but never entirely forgotten, and the particular quality of sadness she had carried in the years before she finally left, a sadness that had settled so gradually into their household that he had not fully recognized it until she was already gone. He thought of his father afterward, hardening year by year into someone who ruled through fear and calculation, rather than genuine connection, teaching Cade, both through explicit lessons and through the silent example of his own diminished life, that love was simply too dangerous a risk for someone responsible for an entire pack's survival. He had believed that lesson completely, had built his entire adult identity around avoiding exactly the vulnerability his father had warned him against. But standing here now, faced with the very real possibility that Elena might be genuinely lost or hurt somewhere in the forest beyond Thornwood's protection, he found he could no longer sustain the fiction that keeping his distance from her had protected either of them from anything. It had not protected him from feeling this desperate, gnawing fear now that she was gone. It had only ensured that he had wasted the weeks she was actually present. Weeks he could have spent building something real, instead pushing her away out of a fear so deeply ingrained he had never properly examined it until this exact moment. The realization settled over him with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, and beneath the fear for her safety, something else began to take shape, quiet but unmistakable. A fierce, determined resolve that whatever happened next, however far he had to travel, or however long the search required, he intended to find her, and he intended, finally, to be honest with her about everything his careful coldness had kept hidden. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, and Griffin returned to confirm the search parties were ready to depart, Cade shifted quickly into his wolf form, faster and more fluidly than he had shifted in months, driven by an urgency that made the transformation feel almost effortless despite its usual demands. He caught Elena's scent immediately near the base of the trellis, faint but unmistakable, laced with the particular mixture of dried herbs and clean linen that had come to mean, somewhere in his instincts he had refused to acknowledge until now, something dangerously close to home. He set off into the gathering dusk, following the trail she had left behind, driven forward by a combination of fear, guilt, and a hope he barely dared to let himself fully feel, that he might still have the chance to make right everything he had gotten so painfully wrong. The trail led him first through the drainage culvert beneath the outer wall, the same narrow gap Elena had squeezed through nearly 2 nights earlier, and Cade found himself briefly, uselessly impressed by the careful planning evident in her chosen route, evidence of exactly the resourceful competence he had always privately admired in her, but had never once told her directly. He pushed through the gap and picked up her scent again on the far side, following it into the dense forest beyond Thornwood's protected boundary. Night fell quickly once he was beneath the trees, but his wolf senses, sharpened now by both instinct and urgency, had little trouble following the trail even in near-total darkness. He moved swiftly through the underbrush, retracing, without knowing it, nearly the exact path Elena herself had taken 2 nights before, past the rocky hills that had slowed her considerably, along the edge of the stream where she had paused to rest and wash the grime from her face. He caught himself, more than once during that long night of tracking, imagining her moving through this same darkness alone, exhausted and frightened, and each time the image surfaced, it drove him forward with renewed urgency, pushing his pace faster than was strictly wise given the uneven terrain. Griffin and the other search parties had spread out to cover different possible routes, but Cade had insisted on pursuing this particular trail alone, unwilling to slow his progress to accommodate a larger group, and unwilling, too, though he did not fully admit this even to himself, to have witnesses present for whatever raw, unguarded reaction he might have upon finally finding her. Somewhere in the deepest hours of the night, following the trail along the edge of the same rocky hills Elena had navigated, Cade paused to catch his breath and get his bearings, and found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of Delia's stories about his own childhood. Stories he had half forgotten until Elena's absence had forced him to reckon so completely with everything he had spent years avoiding. He remembered, distantly, running through the infirmary as a boy, asking endless questions about herbs and healing, a curiosity that had felt, at the time, like the most natural thing in the world. He remembered, too, the exact moment that curiosity had first begun retreating behind careful walls, a memory of his father finding him in the infirmary one afternoon, and telling him, in a voice cold enough that Cade had never forgotten it, that an alpha's son had no business wasting his time on a healer's foolish curiosities, that such interests belonged to weaker minds, unsuited for leadership. He had believed his father completely, had spent the following years methodically stripping away every soft, curious part of himself in favor of the hard, calculated persona his father insisted a proper leader required. He saw now, with the clarity that only genuine fear seemed capable of producing, how thoroughly that lesson had shaped every choice he had made, regarding Elena, from the very first moment the bond appeared. He had treated his own instinctive draw toward her, that curious, warm pull he had felt so clearly during their quiet evening together in the infirmary during the storm, as exactly the kind of dangerous weakness his father had trained him to fear and reject. The thought settled heavily in his chest as he pushed forward through the darkness. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion of the long night's tracking, a fierce and unfamiliar clarity began to take shape. He understood now, with a certainty that felt almost physically painful in its suddenness, that his father's lesson had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and that following it so faithfully had cost him not safety or strength, but the very thing that might have actually made him a better leader and a better man, the willingness to care, openly and without calculation, for someone who mattered to him. He continued tracking through the remaining hours of darkness, catching Elena's scent grow fainter in places where the terrain had clearly slowed her progress, and stronger again where she had apparently moved with greater speed and confidence. He noted, with a mixture of relief and renewed guilt, the evidence along her trail that she had traveled carefully and competently, choosing sensible routes, resting when necessary, showing none of the panicked, reckless movement he had feared might have led her into real danger. Whatever else he had gotten wrong, he thought grimly, he had at least been right about one thing from the very beginning. Elena Voss did not need anyone's protection to survive difficult circumstances. She had proven that resilience, again and again, first in building her career as a healer despite modest beginnings, and now in navigating an unfamiliar forest alone, rather than accepting a life that no longer honored her. The realization did nothing to ease the fear driving him forward, but it did shift something in the quality of that fear, transforming it gradually from a frantic terror that she might be lost or hurt, into something closer to a desperate hope that he might simply reach her before too much more time passed, before whatever fragile chance remained for him to make things right slipped entirely out of his grasp. As the first gray light of dawn began filtering weakly through the trees overhead, Cade caught a stronger thread of Elena's scent, fresher now, mixed with the unmistakable smell of wood smoke, and the ordinary bustle of human and pack activity that could only mean he was approaching a settled town. He pushed forward with renewed urgency, his exhausted muscles protesting the pace, but his determination overriding every physical complaint, until finally, the trees began thinning ahead of him, giving way to cultivated fields that stretched toward a cluster of rooftops, visible in the pale morning light. He paused at the tree line, catching his breath, and shifted back into his human form, aware that arriving in Millhaven as a wolf, unannounced and unexplained, would likely cause exactly the kind of alarm and complication he did not have the patience to navigate this particular morning. He dressed quickly in the simple traveling clothes he had thought to bring, and stood for a moment at the edge of the field, studying the town ahead of him, gathering himself for whatever conversation waited on the other side of this final stretch of distance between himself and Elena. He thought, standing there in the cool morning air, with the sun just beginning to rise properly over the horizon, of everything he needed to say to her, of the apology he owed her that went far deeper than the halting, incomplete admission he had offered after the dance with Priya, of the honest reckoning with his own fear, that he finally understood he could no longer keep hidden behind careful walls and calculated distance. He did not know, standing there, whether she would even be willing to listen, whether the damage he had already done might prove too extensive to repair regardless of how genuinely he had changed overnight. But he knew, with a certainty that felt entirely new and entirely his own, rather than inherited from his father's cold lessons, that he intended to try, whatever the outcome, because the alternative, returning to Thornwood without her, and continuing the careful, guarded life he had built for himself, no longer felt like safety. It felt, instead, exactly like the same hollow existence he had watched his own father settle into after losing Rosalind, and Cade found, standing at the edge of that quiet morning field, that he was no longer willing to accept that same fate for himself. He straightened his shoulders, pushed down the last of his exhaustion, and began walking toward Millhaven, toward whatever conversation, difficult or hopeful, waited for him within its gates. Elena rose before dawn that morning, as had become her habit since arriving in Millhaven, drawn from sleep by the same restless ache that had followed her every night since leaving Thornwood. She dressed quietly and made her way down to the small garden behind the apothecary, hoping the cool morning air and the familiar work of tending Odette's herbs might settle the persistent unease that had kept her sleep shallow and fitful for the past several nights. She knelt among the rows of chamomile and lavender, pulling weeds with careful, methodical movements, letting the simple physical task occupy her hands, while her mind wandered, as it so often did lately, back toward Thornwood despite her every effort to keep it firmly fixed on her new life. She told herself the restlessness was simply the natural process of adjustment, that any significant change required time to settle properly, and that the ache in her chest would eventually fade the longer she remained here, building her new life with steady, patient determination. She did not hear him approach at first, absorbed as she was in her work and in her own circling thoughts. It was the sudden, sharp intensification of the ache in her chest that alerted her, before any physical sound did, a pull so strong and so unmistakable that she froze completely, her hands still buried in the soft garden earth, every instinct in her body suddenly, electrically alert. She turned slowly, already knowing with absolute certainty what she would find, and there, standing at the edge of the garden with the first pale light of dawn breaking behind him, stood Cade, travel-worn and exhausted, his clothes rumpled and dirt-streaked from what had clearly been a long, difficult journey through the forest. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Elena remained kneeling among the herbs, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, caught somewhere between the overwhelming relief her instincts insisted on feeling at the sight of him, and the sharp, defensive anger that rose up immediately alongside it, remembering exactly why she had left in the first place. She rose slowly to her feet, brushing the dirt from her hands, and found her voice before he found his. She asked him, her tone carefully controlled despite the turmoil inside her, how he had found her, and more importantly, why he had bothered to try. Cade's exhaustion was evident in every line of his posture, but his eyes, when they met hers, held none of the careful distance she had grown so accustomed to seeing there. He said he had tracked her scent through the forest, following the trail she had left from the moment she climbed out her window, and that he had not slept at all since discovering she was gone, driven by a fear for her safety more intense than anything he had experienced in years. Elena told him, evenly, that she had managed the journey perfectly well on her own, that she had not needed rescuing, and that whatever fear had driven him here was, frankly, misplaced concern for a woman he had made abundantly clear he did not particularly want as his mate. She watched something flicker across his face at her words, a flash of pain quickly suppressed, and for a moment, she almost regretted the sharpness of her tone. Almost. She reminded herself firmly of every reason she had climbed out that window in the first place, and held her ground, arms crossed, waiting for whatever explanation he had traveled through an entire forest to deliver. Cade was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the cool morning air, and then he said, quietly, that he had come to tell her he had been wrong, about everything, from the very first moment the bond appeared. He said he had spent his entire life believing that attachment was a weakness no leader could afford, a lesson drilled into him by a father who had watched his own mate leave, and had chosen, in response, to harden himself completely, rather than risk that particular pain again. He said he had applied that same hardening to Elena from the very beginning, treating her as a political inconvenience, rather than allowing himself to feel anything real toward her, because feeling anything real felt, to him, like the first step toward the same devastating loss his father had never recovered from. Elena listened to this with her arms still crossed, her expression carefully guarded, though something in her chest had begun to loosen slightly, despite her determination to remain unmoved. She told him that understanding the source of his coldness did not erase the damage it had caused, that she had spent weeks feeling like nothing more than a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be valued, culminating in a public humiliation at the autumn gathering that half the pack was probably still discussing. Cade's expression tightened with what looked like genuine shame at the mention of the dance, and he said he owed her a far more complete apology for that than the incomplete, defensive explanation he had offered afterward. He said he had known, even as he crossed the hall toward Priya, that the gesture would hurt her, and that he had chosen to do it anyway, because focusing on political calculation felt safer, in that moment, than confronting how much he had already begun to care about her feelings. He said he had come to realize during the long night of tracking her through the forest, the exact pattern he had built his entire adult identity around, choosing calculated safety over genuine connection, every single time a choice presented itself. Elena felt her carefully maintained composure wavering, torn between the part of her that wanted, desperately, to believe this sudden, thorough honesty, and the part of her that remembered, vividly, every previous moment of hope she had allowed herself during their weeks together. Hope that had always, eventually, been crushed beneath some new demonstration of his calculated distance. She asked him, her voice rougher than she intended, what exactly had changed between the man who had danced with Priya in front of the entire pack and the man standing before her now, travel-worn, and apparently willing to say anything to bring her back. Cade did not answer immediately. He seemed to consider the question carefully, as though determined to offer her something more substantial than a simple, easy reassurance. Finally he said that what had changed was the moment he stood in her empty room, staring at that open window, and felt something inside him break, that he had spent his entire adult life carefully protecting from exactly this kind of pain. He said the fear he felt in that moment, imagining her alone and possibly in danger somewhere in the forest, had shown him with brutal clarity that his careful, guarded distance had never actually protected him from anything. It had only ensured he wasted every opportunity to build something real with her while she was still present, choosing instead the false safety of never risking genuine attachment at all. He said his father had taught him that love was a door left open for pain to walk through, and that keeping every door locked was the only way to protect a pack's leadership from vulnerability. He said he understood now, standing here in this quiet garden after a night spent tracking her through unfamiliar forest, that his father had been wrong, that keeping every door locked had not protected him from pain at all. It had only guaranteed he would eventually cause exactly the kind of pain he had spent his life trying to avoid, both to himself and to the person unlucky enough to be bound to him. Elena stood in silence for a long moment after he finished speaking, the morning light growing steadily brighter around them, illuminating the exhaustion etched into his face, the sincerity that seemed, for the first time since she had known him, entirely unguarded. She wanted to believe him. Some deep, instinctive part of her, tied irrevocably to the bond neither of them had chosen, already did believe him, had perhaps believed him, from the moment she first felt his presence in the garden, and turned to find him standing there. But belief alone, she reminded herself firmly, was not enough to undo weeks of careful hurt, and she was not willing to simply fold back into his arms, because he had finally said the words she had been hoping to hear since that first painful meeting in his study. She told him, evenly, that she appreciated his honesty, and that some part of her recognized the courage it must have taken to travel this far and admit so much. But she said she needed more than words, more than a single dramatic morning of apology after weeks of calculated coldness, before she could trust that anything between them had truly changed. Cade nodded slowly, accepting this without argument, and said he understood completely, that he had not traveled through an entire night of forest, expecting her to simply forgive everything on the spot. He said he was prepared to earn back whatever trust his own fear and pride had cost them, however long that process required, and that he had no intention of returning to Thornwood without at least the chance to try. Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against the exhaustion and sincerity written so plainly across his face, and felt something inside her chest, some careful wall she had built alongside her decision to leave, begin, very slightly, to shift. Before she could respond further, the back door of the apothecary opened, and Odette stepped out into the garden, clearly having heard voices and come to investigate. She took in the scene before her with the sharp, assessing gaze of a woman who missed very little, her eyes moving from Elena's guarded posture to the travel-worn stranger, standing at the garden's edge, and something in her expression suggested she had already guessed a great deal about the situation, without needing a single word of explanation. Elena, uncertain how to introduce the moment, simply said that this was Cade, and that he had come from Thornwood. Odette's eyebrows rose slightly at the name, evidence that she had put together enough pieces over the preceding weeks to understand its significance, but she said nothing accusatory, only asked, with brisk practicality, whether their visitor intended to stay for breakfast, since standing in a garden discussing serious matters on an empty stomach rarely improved anyone's judgment. The unexpected, ordinary kindness of the offer seemed to catch Cade off guard, and he accepted with a gratitude that struck Elena as genuine, rather than merely polite. Odette disappeared back inside to prepare a simple meal, leaving Elena and Cade alone in the garden once more, though the interruption had shifted something in the tension between them, softening its sharpest edges just slightly. Elena asked him, more gently than before, how the rest of the pack had reacted to her disappearance. Curious despite herself about what chaos her departure might have caused back at Thornwood, Cade admitted that the reaction had been significant, that Griselda and several other elders had initially seemed more concerned with the political implications of a missing Luna than with her actual safety, a response that had, he said, sparked the first moment of real anger he had allowed himself to feel in front of the full council since taking his position as Alpha. He described, haltingly, the search parties he had organized, the long night of tracking through unfamiliar forest, and Elena listened with a complicated mixture of feelings, touched, despite herself, by the evident lengths he had gone to in order to find her, while still holding firmly to her resolve not to be swept away by gestures alone, however dramatic or exhausting they had proven to be. She asked him, carefully, what he intended to do about the pressure from the council regarding a possible alliance with Ridgeline, the very issue that had, more than anything else, driven her final decision to leave. Cade's expression grew serious, and he said he had already made his position clear to Griselda and the others before setting out to find her, that he had no intention of pursuing any arrangement with Priya or with Ridgeline, that the bond between himself and Elena was the only bond he intended to honor, regardless of whatever political inconvenience that honesty might cause among the older council members, still clinging to his father's rigid ideas about strategic marriage. He said Griselda had not taken the news particularly well, but that he had told her plainly he would rather step down as Alpha entirely than force himself into a loveless political marriage, the way his own father had nearly done to his mother, before circumstances had made an actual marriage unnecessary. He said watching his father's household hollow out slowly over the years, after Rosalind's departure, had taught him exactly what a marriage built on calculation, rather than genuine connection, eventually became, and that he refused, now that he finally understood the cost of that path clearly, to walk it himself. Elena absorbed this admission slowly, recognizing in it a level of commitment she had not expected him to reach so quickly, or so firmly. She reminded herself, even as some cautious hope began building steadily in her chest, that promises made in the heat of an emotional reunion were easier to offer than promises kept over the long, ordinary stretch of everyday life that would follow. She had watched enough patients in her healing work make similarly heartfelt promises during moments of crisis, only to slip back into old patterns once the immediate crisis had passed. She told him this honestly, without softening the observation to spare his feelings, and Cade nodded slowly, accepting the caution without argument. He said he understood why she would doubt the durability of a promise made after one long, difficult night, and that he did not expect her to simply trust him based on words alone. He said he was prepared to prove it instead, through action, through patience, through however much time it took for his behavior to earn back the trust his earlier coldness had cost them both. Odette called them in for breakfast a short while later, and the conversation shifted, gratefully, into gentler territory over the simple meal she had prepared, questions about Elena's work at the apothecary, and her growing skill with the unfamiliar herbs in Odette's garden, careful, tentative territory that felt, to Elena, like the first genuine attempt either of them had made to simply know each other as people, apart from the weight of politics and bonds and expectation. By the time the meal ended, Elena had not yet given Cade the answer he had traveled so far to hear, but something essential had shifted between them nonetheless, a fragile, cautious opening, where before there had only been careful walls and painful distance. She did not yet know what she would ultimately decide, but for the first time since climbing out that window, she found herself genuinely uncertain whether returning to Thornwood might, after all, be the wrong choice to rule out entirely. Cade did not return to Thornwood that day, nor the day after, and Elena found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, glad of the delay, rather than troubled by it. He had taken a room at the same tavern where Elena herself had spent her first night in Millhaven, and had sent word back to Thornwood through one of the search party warriors he encountered on the outskirts of town, informing Griffin and the council that he had located Elena safely, and intended to remain nearby while matters between them were properly worked through, however long that process required. Elena learned of this arrangement from Odette, who had heard it secondhand from the tavern keeper, and felt an unexpected warmth at the evidence that Cade had chosen patience over pressure, giving her space to decide things at her own pace, rather than demanding an immediate answer. Over the following days, a careful new rhythm established itself between them. Cade did not attempt to insert himself into her work at the apothecary, understanding, apparently without needing to be told, that Elena's growing sense of independence and competence in her new role was not something she was willing to have overshadowed or diminished by his presence. Instead, he found small, unobtrusive ways to be helpful around Millhaven, offering his considerable strength to a farmer struggling with a stubborn fence post, helping the town's aging blacksmith haul heavy supplies that had grown too much for the older man to manage alone. Elena heard about these small acts of service from various townspeople before she witnessed any of them herself, and each report chipped away, slowly, at the careful guard she had maintained since his arrival in the garden. This was not the calculating, politically minded alpha she had watched dance with Priya in front of an entire delegation. This was someone quietly, unglamorously proving himself useful to a community that owed him nothing and expected nothing from him, without any audience of council elders or visiting dignitaries present to witness the gesture and calculate its political value. She finally agreed to walk with him one evening, nearly 4 days after his arrival, along the quiet path that ran beside the stream at the edge of town, the same stream she had followed briefly during her own journey through the forest. The evening air carried the last warmth of the day, and for a while they walked in comfortable silence, neither of them rushing to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. Eventually, Elena was the one who broke the silence, asking him, directly, whether he had told her everything, or whether there remained pieces of his history and his fears that he had kept carefully hidden even now, in the midst of what he claimed was complete honesty. She said she was tired of discovering, gradually and often painfully, layers of explanation for his behavior that he had not thought to share up front, and that if there was truly going to be any future for them, she needed him capable of offering his full honesty without her having to extract it piece by piece through overheard conversations or second-hand stories from the pack staff. Cade was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously rather than rushing to reassure her, and Elena appreciated the pause, recognizing in it a genuine effort to answer honestly rather than simply say whatever might smooth the conversation forward most easily. He said there was one thing he had not yet told her, something he had barely admitted to himself until the long night of tracking her through the forest had forced him to examine it fully. He said that beyond the general fear of attachment his father's example had instilled in him, there was a more specific fear buried underneath it, one connected directly to the moment the bond had first appeared during his coronation. He explained that in the instant the pull hit him, standing at the front of that crowded hall, his very first reaction had not actually been anger, whatever his expression might have suggested to the watching crowd. His first reaction had been something closer to terror, a visceral, overwhelming fear that mirrored exactly the fear he remembered feeling as a boy of 10, watching his mother pack a single bag and disappear from their household forever. He said the intensity of the bond, arriving so suddenly and so completely, had felt to him, in that first disorienting moment, like a door being thrown wide open onto exactly the kind of vulnerability that had destroyed his father, and he had reacted by slamming that door shut, as hard and as fast as he possibly could, before he had even properly registered who stood on the other side of it. He said the anger everyone had witnessed on his face that night had been real, but it had been anger directed inward, at his own instincts for betraying every careful wall he had spent years building, rather than anger at Elena herself, though he understood completely why she would have interpreted it that way, since he had done nothing in the following weeks to correct that impression. Elena absorbed this explanation slowly, walking beside him in silence for several long moments, as she turned it over in her mind. It reframed, in some ways, the entire painful beginning of their arrangement, though it did not erase the very real hurt his subsequent weeks of calculated coldness had caused her. She told him this honestly, that understanding the fear behind his initial reaction helped her make sense of that first terrible night, but that it did not fully explain or excuse the weeks that followed, weeks where he had continued choosing distance and political calculation, even after they had shared genuine, warm moments together, like the evening during the storm in the infirmary. Cade nodded, accepting this distinction without argument. He said the initial fear had been instinctive, nearly impossible to control in the moment it struck him. But the weeks that followed, he admitted, had been a choice, repeated over and over, to keep retreating behind that initial fear, rather than examining it honestly and working past it. He said he had told himself, during those weeks, that maintaining distance was the responsible choice for an alpha still establishing his authority, that personal feelings could not be allowed to interfere with political necessity. But he understood now, looking back, that this reasoning had simply been a more sophisticated version of the same fear, dressed up in the language of duty and responsibility, to make it feel less like cowardice and more like wisdom. The honesty in this admission struck Elena more deeply than anything he had said in the garden days earlier. There was no attempt here to soften his own responsibility, no convenient framing that positioned him as simply a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He was naming, plainly and without excuse, the exact pattern of choices he had made, and taking full ownership of the pain those choices had caused her. She told him, quietly, about her own experience of those weeks, filling in details she had not previously shared, describing the particular sting of watching him show easy warmth to his injured warrior in the infirmary while maintaining such careful distance from her, describing the sleepless night after overhearing Griselda's proposal about Priya, describing the quiet, exhausted resolve that had finally carried her out that window, and through an entire night of forest travel, toward a town she had never visited, simply because staying, and continuing to hope for something better, had begun to feel more painful than leaving everything familiar behind. Cade listened to all of it, without interrupting, his expression carrying a visible weight that suggested each detail landed with real impact rather than polite, distracted attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, roughly, that hearing it laid out so plainly, in her own words rather than filtered through his own defensive interpretation of events, made the full scope of what he had put her through considerably harder to bear than he had expected, even after everything the past several days had already forced him to confront. They walked in silence for a while after that, the evening deepening around them, the stream murmuring steadily alongside the path. Elena found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of her own mother, gone many years now, who had once told her, during a difficult stretch of her early training, when she had doubted whether she possessed the strength required to become a proper healer, that the measure of a person's character was not whether they made mistakes, since everyone did eventually, but whether they possessed the courage to fully acknowledge those mistakes once recognized, rather than continuing to justify or minimize them out of pride. She found herself measuring Cade against that particular standard, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that he was meeting it more completely than she had expected when she first agreed to this evening walk. He was not minimizing what he had done. He was not offering excuses dressed up as explanations. He was simply, painfully, owning the full weight of his choices, and expressing, through both his words and the quiet, patient actions of the preceding days, a genuine commitment to becoming someone capable of choosing differently going forward. She stopped walking eventually, turning to face him directly in the fading evening light, and asked him the question that had been building steadily inside her since their conversation in the garden days earlier. She asked him what, specifically, he was prepared to do differently, concretely, if she agreed to give this bond, and him, a genuine second chance, rather than simply promising in the abstract to be better. Cade considered the question seriously, and his answer, when it came, was more specific and more thoughtful than Elena had anticipated. He said he intended to formally reject any further consideration of a political marriage, publicly and unambiguously, before the full council, removing entirely the uncertainty that had driven her final decision to leave. He said he intended to make space for her own work and her own independence, within whatever role she chose to occupy in Thornwood going forward, rather than expecting her simply to fold seamlessly into whatever traditional expectations existed for Aluna. He said he intended, too, to work actively at unlearning the patterns his father had instilled in him, seeking guidance from Griffin and Delia and anyone else in the pack who might help him recognize when old, guarded habits were beginning to resurface, rather than trusting himself alone to catch every instance where fear might quietly override honesty. The specificity of the answer, the evident thought he had clearly put into it during the days since finding her, carried more weight with Elena than any amount of general reassurance could have managed. She recognized in it the same quality she valued in her own healing work, the understanding that real change required concrete, deliberate practice, not simply good intentions offered once and then abandoned when circumstances grew difficult again. She did not give him a final answer that evening, still unwilling to rush a decision that would shape the entire remainder of her life. But as they walked back toward town beneath a sky now fully dark and scattered with stars, she found the persistent ache in her chest. The one that had followed her every mile from Thornwood to Millhaven had settled, for the first time in weeks, into something considerably closer to peace. 2 days later, a letter arrived for Elena at the apothecary, carried by one of the search party warriors who had returned briefly to Thornwood and come back to Millhaven bearing correspondence. The letter was from Delia, and Elena opened it with hands that trembled slightly, uncertain what news from the pack hall might contain. Delia's letter was brief but warm, expressing relief that Elena had been found safe, and offering, in her characteristically direct way, an observation that struck Elena deeply. Delia wrote that she had watched Cade in the days immediately following Elena's disappearance, before word arrived that she had been located, and that she had never in all her years serving the Ashford family witnessed the young Alpha so thoroughly undone. She wrote that whatever choice Elena ultimately made, she wanted her to know that the fear driving Cade's earlier coldness had been real and deeply rooted, but that the change she had witnessed in him over those anxious days seemed equally real, a genuine crack in walls that had stood unshaken since childhood. Delia closed the letter with a small piece of advice, offered gently rather than as any kind of pressure toward a particular decision. She wrote that Rosalind, Cade's mother, had left because she had waited far too long for a change that never came, hoping year after year that patience alone might eventually soften a man who showed no genuine willingness to examine his own fear. She said Cade, in the space of a single devastating week, had already shown more willingness to examine himself than his father had managed in an entire lifetime, and that this distinction, however small it might seem, struck her as meaningful. Elena read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the small collection of belongings she kept in her room above the apothecary. She thought about Delia's words throughout the remainder of that day, turning them over as she worked, measuring them against her own careful observations of Cade over the preceding days. The quiet, unglamorous kindness he had shown various townspeople, without any audience to appreciate the gesture. The specific, thoughtful commitments he had outlined during their walk beside the stream. The raw honesty with which he had finally named the fear at the root of his very first reaction to the bond. That evening, Cade found her again in Odette's garden, where she had taken to sitting after the shop closed, watching the last light fade over the herb rows. He did not press her for an answer, seeming to understand, without needing to be told, that pressure would only work against whatever fragile trust they had begun rebuilding. He simply sat beside her in comfortable silence for a while, and then mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he had spent the afternoon helping Odette repair a section of fencing along the back of the garden that had been leaning precariously for months, work Elena had noticed, but never found time to address herself amid her other responsibilities. The small, practical gesture, offered without any expectation of praise or acknowledgement, settled something further inside Elena's chest. She found herself thinking of every grand, dramatic gesture that had characterized their relationship until now. The sudden appearance of the bond itself, the very public dance with Priya, the desperate overnight journey through the forest to find her, and recognized that grand gestures, however emotionally significant, had never actually been what she needed most from him. What she needed, she realized, watching him now in the quiet evening light, was exactly this, the steady, unremarkable evidence of someone choosing, again and again, in small ordinary moments, to be considerate and present, rather than calculating and distant. She turned to him finally, and told him she was ready to give him her answer. Cade went very still beside her, his earlier patience visibly straining under the weight of the moment, though he said nothing, waiting for her to continue in her own time. Elena told him that she was not offering blind trust, not yet, and that she intended to watch carefully, over whatever months or years followed, whether the changes he had described so specifically during their walk actually held steady, once the immediate crisis of her disappearance had faded into ordinary life again. But she said she was willing, cautiously and with her eyes open, to return to Thornwood and give this bond, and him, the genuine chance neither of them had properly given it before, back when fear and calculation had governed nearly every choice he made. Relief broke across Cade's face so completely, so without any of his usual careful composure, that Elena felt something in her own chest loosen in response, a wariness she had carried for weeks finally beginning to properly ease. He reached for her hand, hesitant, as though still uncertain whether the gesture would be welcome, and when she did not pull away, he held it gently, his thumb tracing an absent, careful pattern across her knuckles, as though he could not quite believe she was truly there beside him, choosing, however cautiously, to give him this chance. They sat together in the darkening garden for a long while after that, talking quietly about the practical matters that would need addressing before they could return to Thornwood together, her position at the apothecary, which Odette would need time to fill properly, her promise to Marissa and Delia that she would find some way to thank them for their kindness, and the larger, more complicated matter of how Cade intended to formally address the council regarding his rejection of any political marriage, a conversation Elena suspected would not go smoothly, given how thoroughly some among the elders had invested in the Ridgeline Alliance. But for that one quiet evening, sitting together in Odette's garden, with the last light fading into full darkness overhead, neither of them rushed ahead into the difficulties, still waiting for them back at Thornwood. They simply sat together, hands joined, allowing themselves, for the first time since the bond had first appeared during that fateful coronation, to feel something that resembled genuine, uncomplicated hope for whatever came next. Before they finally rose to head back inside, Elena added one more condition, quietly but firmly, wanting it understood clearly, before either of them let the warmth of the evening carry them too far ahead of themselves. She told him that if she returned to Thornwood, she would not be returning to occupy some decorative version of the Luna role, present only for ceremony and appearance. She intended to continue her healing work, fully and without apology, alongside whatever responsibilities came with standing beside him as his mate, and she needed him to support that intention completely, not merely tolerate it as an inconvenient compromise. Cade agreed without a moment's hesitation, and told her, with a sincerity that carried none of his earlier careful formality, that he had no interest in a mate who existed only as a symbol beside him. He said he wanted a partner, capable and outspoken and entirely herself, and that watching her build an independent life here in Millhaven, entirely through her own skill and determination, had only deepened his respect for exactly the qualities he hoped she would continue bringing fully into whatever future they built together. Elena studied his face in the last of the fading light, searching, out of old habit, for any trace of calculation or convenient performance behind his words, and found none. Satisfied, she rose finally from the garden bench, and together they walked back inside, toward the beginning of whatever came next. They left Millhaven 3 days later, giving Odette enough time to arrange temporary help at the apothecary, and giving Elena the chance to properly say goodbye to the small community that had welcomed her so generously during her weeks of uncertainty. The farewell with Odette proved harder than Elena had expected. The older woman, usually so brisk and practical, embraced her tightly at the shop's threshold and told her, gruffly, that Millhaven's apothecary would always have a place for her if circumstances ever required it. An offer Elena understood carried real weight rather than mere polite sentiment. She thanked Odette for her kindness, for the steady, unquestioning acceptance that had allowed her to rebuild her confidence during those difficult first weeks away from Thornwood, and promised to write regularly once she was settled again. Willa, the young mother whose infant daughter's cough Elena had treated weeks earlier, stopped by the shop on their final morning to offer her own goodbye, bringing with her a small woven basket of preserves as a parting gift. She told Elena, with characteristic warmth, that she hoped whatever waited for her back within pack walls would bring her the same easy contentment Willa herself had found in choosing a different life, though she added, with a knowing smile, that from the way Cade had looked at Elena during his weeks in Millhaven, she suspected that contentment was already well within reach. The journey back to Thornwood took considerably less time than Elena's original escape had required, since this time they traveled openly on the main roads, rather than cutting carefully through dense, unmarked forest, and Cade's presence meant they moved with an escort of warriors who had remained in Millhaven awaiting his decision. Elena found the return journey strange in its ease, compared to the desperate, exhausting flight that had brought her to Millhaven in the first place, and used the quiet hours of travel to prepare herself, mentally, for whatever reception awaited her at the pack hall. She did not know, exactly, what to expect. She assumed the story of her disappearance and subsequent return had already spread thoroughly through Thornwood, likely accumulating dramatic embellishments with every retelling, and she braced herself for curious stares and whispered speculation similar to what she had endured during the earliest days of the mating bond's appearance. What she found, upon their arrival, surprised her considerably. Marissa met them at the gate, her relief so evident and so immediate that she embraced Elena without any regard for the watching warriors or the formality typically expected in front of visiting escorts. And Elena found herself laughing, genuinely, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, hugging her friend back just as fiercely. Delia, too, greeted her warmly, drawing her aside briefly to say, quietly, that she had watched Cade closely during the difficult days of the search, and that whatever remained to be proven through his future actions, she believed, based on what she had witnessed, that the change in him was genuine, rather than merely a performance driven by temporary panic. Elena thanked her for the letter she had sent to Millhaven, and for the wisdom it had offered during a moment when she badly needed outside perspective on a decision that felt, at the time, nearly impossible to make with any clarity. The formal council meeting Cade had promised took place 2 days after their return, and Elena attended, standing beside him rather than seated among the observing pack members as she might once have been expected to do, a small but deliberate signal of the changed dynamic between them that Cade had insisted upon before the meeting even began. Griselda, predictably, raised her concerns about the abandoned possibility of a Ridgeline alliance, framing her objections carefully in terms of pack security and long-term strategic advantage, rather than any personal criticism of Elena directly. Cade listened to the full argument without interrupting, and then responded with a firmness Elena had not previously witnessed from him in any council setting, stating plainly that he understood the strategic value Griselda continued to emphasize, but that he would not build his pack's future security on the foundation of a loveless political marriage, having watched exactly that choice hollow out his own father across decades of quiet, mutual misery. He said, further, that a pack's true strength came not from calculated alliances alone, but from leadership capable of genuine partnership, honest enough to acknowledge mistakes, and steady enough to build real trust rather than mere political convenience. He said he intended to honor his bond with Elena fully, publicly, and without further hesitation, and that any council member who continued to doubt this decision was welcome to raise their concerns directly with him, rather than continuing to pursue alternative arrangements behind closed doors. The room fell silent following this declaration, and Elena, standing beside him, felt a fierce swell of something like pride at witnessing him hold his position so firmly, in such stark contrast to the hesitant, non-committal response she had overheard weeks earlier through that partially open council chamber door. Griselda, after a long moment, inclined her head in acknowledgement, apparently recognizing that further argument would prove pointless against a decision delivered with such evident conviction, and the matter, at least formally, was settled. In the weeks that followed, Elena settled gradually back into pack life, though on considerably different terms than her earlier arrangement had established. She returned to her healing work in the infirmary, working alongside Delia with a renewed sense of purpose and confidence, and Cade, true to his word, made no attempt to diminish or overshadow that work, instead making a point of publicly acknowledging her skill and her value to the pack whenever the opportunity arose, a small but meaningful reversal of the careful distance he had once maintained. Their relationship did not transform overnight into something effortless and entirely free of difficulty. There were moments, in those early weeks, when old habits threatened to resurface, when Cade caught himself retreating toward careful, guarded formality during a stressful council session, or when Elena found herself bracing instinctively for disappointment during moments that required real vulnerability from him. But each time, one or the other of them named the pattern honestly, rather than letting it fester unaddressed the way it once had, and slowly, through that repeated, deliberate practice, something genuinely new began to take shape between them, built not on the sudden, overwhelming force of the mating bond alone, but on the steadier, more durable foundation of honest effort and earned trust. Griffin, watching this gradual transformation with the same quiet attention he brought to every aspect of pack life, remarked once to Delia that he had not seen an Ashford household carry this particular quality of warmth since long before Rosalind's departure, a comment that eventually made its way back to Cade himself and struck him, when he heard it, with a depth of emotion he did not attempt to hide from Elena when he shared the observation with her that evening. Nearly 2 months after their return to Thornwood, on a quiet evening much like the one that had marked the true beginning of their story, sitting together in the same infirmary, where a sudden storm had once offered them their first genuine conversation. Cade told Elena that he had recently written to Priya, formally and respectfully, informing her that Thornwood's position on the proposed alliance remained unchanged, and offering instead his pack's continued friendship and trade partnership with Ridgeline, on terms that required no marriage to secure them. He said Priya had responded graciously, expressing what seemed like genuine relief rather than disappointment, since she had apparently found, in the months following her own visit to Thornwood, someone within her own pack whose affection required no political calculation at all. Elena smiled at this news, feeling a small, warm satisfaction at the thought of Priya finding her own uncomplicated happiness, free from the tangled political maneuvering that had briefly threatened both their futures. She told Cade she was glad, and meant it fully, without a trace of the earlier anxiety that woman's name had once carried for her. As the evening deepened around them, Cade reached for her hand, the same careful, tentative gesture he had first offered her weeks earlier in Odette's garden, though this time there was nothing hesitant in the way she laced her fingers through his in response. He told her, quietly, that he did not know exactly what the coming years would bring, what challenges Thornwood might face, or what difficulties they might still need to navigate together, as their bond continued to deepen and mature beyond its uncertain, painful beginning. But he said he knew, with a certainty that felt entirely his own, rather than inherited from anyone else's fear or example, that he wanted to face whatever came alongside her, honestly, and without the careful, guarded distance that had cost them both so much during those first difficult weeks. Elena, looking at him in the soft evening light of the infirmary where their story had first properly begun, found she believed him completely, not because of any single dramatic gesture or desperate overnight journey through the forest, but because of the steady, patient, ordinary evidence of the past 2 months. Small kindness after small kindness, honest conversation after honest conversation, slowly rebuilding something that felt, finally, genuinely worth trusting. She had once climbed out a window in the dead of night, determined to escape a bond that felt, at the time, like nothing more than a cage dressed up as fate. She returned to Thornwood not because the bond itself had forced her hand, but because the man on the other end of it had finally proven himself willing to meet her honestly, as an equal partner rather than a political convenience, and that distinction, she understood now, made all the difference between a cage and a home. Outside the infirmary window, the training yard sat quiet beneath a rising moon, much as it had on that very first night when she had watched it from her borrowed room, uncertain and alone. This time, she watched it from beside Cade, his hand steady in hers, both of them finally, genuinely, choosing each other, and choosing, together, whatever came next. Marissa organized a small gathering the following week, nothing so formal as the coronation or the autumn council, simply a modest celebration among pack members who had watched the difficult early weeks of Elena and Cade's bond unfold, and wanted, now, to mark the steadier chapter that seemed to be taking root in its place. Elena found herself moved by the gesture, by the warmth of the pack members who approached her throughout the evening, many of them the same people who had once whispered behind their hands as she hurried past, now offering genuine congratulations and easy conversation instead. Delia pulled her aside at one point during the evening, studying her with the same sharp, assessing attention she brought to examining a difficult wound, and told her that she saw, in Elena's face, none of the strained composure she had worn during those first painful weeks after the coronation. She said Elena looked, instead, like a woman who had built her own happiness deliberately, brick by careful brick, rather than one who had simply been handed a fortunate outcome by circumstance alone, and that the distinction mattered, in Delia's long experience, more than almost anything else when it came to predicting whether a bond would truly last. Cade found her again near the end of the evening, drawing her gently away from the gathering, toward the quiet edge of the training yard, where their earliest days together had unfolded in such uncertainty. He told her he had one more thing he wanted to share, something he had been considering since their conversation weeks earlier in Millhaven, about what kind of partnership she needed from him going forward. He said he intended to establish, formally, a standing seat on the pack council for the head healer's position, a role Elena would hold, not because of her connection to him as his mate, but because her expertise and judgment deserved a genuine voice in decisions that affected the well-being of every pack member. He said he had already discussed the proposal with Griselda and the other elders, who had, somewhat to his surprise, offered less resistance than he anticipated, several of them privately admitting that the pack's healing concerns had gone underrepresented in council decisions for far too long. Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved by the gesture in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. It was, she recognized, exactly the kind of concrete, structural change that mattered more than any romantic promise alone could. A genuine redistribution of respect and authority, rather than a symbolic gesture, offered only in private, warm moments between the two of them. She told him this, and he said, simply, that he intended to keep proving himself through exactly this kind of concrete action, for as long as it took, and for as long as they remained bound together. They stood together at the edge of the quiet training yard, as the celebration continued behind them, the sound of laughter and easy conversation drifting across the cool evening air, and Elena allowed herself, finally and completely, to feel something she had not dared to feel since that very first devastating night of the coronation. A settled, genuine hope that whatever bond had claimed them both against their will had grown, through patience and honesty and hard-earned trust, into something neither of them needed to escape from ever again.